Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are joining us from around the world. My name is John Allen, and I'm the president of the Brookings Institution. It's a great pleasure to welcome you today to our first day of the week-long conference entitled The Middle East and the New U.S. Administration. Today's conference marks the successful conclusion of the first year of the Center for Middle East Policy's project on sources of Middle East instability, a wide-ranging project that is central to the center's mission of, quote, chart the path, political, economic, and social, to a Middle East at peace with itself and with the world. I'd like to take this opportunity to express our sincere gratitude to Anne and Andrew Tisch for their support of this project. They are treasured friends and valuable partners and thought partners for the institution. Without their generous support and steadfast commitment to Brookings' core values of independence, which allows our scholars complete discretion in their work and studies, our Center for Middle East Policy would not be able to produce its array of research and analysis year-round, let alone for this week's conference. Finally, as someone who has personally spent a lot of time in the Middle East, both in and out of uniform, I cannot express enough how timely today's conference is, especially as President Biden continues to navigate his first 100 days in office. I'm confident that our excellent series of speakers and panels that will help articulate not only the present state of affairs in this region, but the future of America's role in it. So with that, let me turn the floor over to our director of the Center for Middle East Policy, Natan Sachs, who will be providing further information on this week's programming, as well as to introduce our first panel. Natan, over to you.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Natan Sachs. I'm the director of the Center for Middle East Policy. We're delighted that so many of you have joined us from around the world. This week will feature 4 days of public discussions, today and then Wednesday through Friday, with leaders and experts from the Middle East and North Africa, the United States, and around the world. Headlining our series are two heads of state, the President of Iraq, His Excellency Barham Saleh, who will join us for a conversation on Wednesday, and His Majesty King Abdullah II of Jordan, from whom we'll hear in recorded remarks on Thursday. Among our distinguished guests are also ministers, former ministers, and ambassadors from Morocco, Algeria, the United Arab Emirates, the Palestinian Authority, Jordan, the United Kingdom, Germany, and later this morning, Israel. We will also hear from American voices, including the new chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee in Congress on Wednesday, our speakers in this first panel this morning, and many others. I recommend tuning in for all these events, but also highly recommend hearing from some of the brightest experts on issues ranging from water security to US policy on Iran to ongoing conflicts and their aftermath in Yemen, Syria, and elsewhere. We're delighted to host such an array of distinguished leaders, seasoned experts, and new voices to Washington on one virtual stage. All our meetings will be in the mornings, Washington time, to allow for audiences both in the United States and in the region to join in. You can see the full agenda on our website at brookings.edu, and you can join the conversation and submit questions for panelists via Twitter using the hashtag US Middle East. Naturally, given the limited time, we will not cover nearly all the topics we would have liked to, nor from all angles. There are important countries and issues we plan to address in future convenings and research. I invite you to join us for events throughout the year, and especially to read the excellent research of my colleagues from across the foreign policy program and across Brookings in general. I'd like to join John Allen in expressing my thanks to Anne and Andrew Tisch for their support for the Center's core project. This conference, as John said, celebrates the successful first year of this flagship project, and we look forward to many more. This series and our work would not be possible without their dedication to in-depth research and to widening the aperture of policy regarding the region. My thanks also to all my colleagues who helped put this program together, including especially the colleagues who will remain behind the scenes, keeping our event going. In just a moment, we will have our first panel from an American perspective on US policy priorities in the Middle East. You can see the full bios of all our speakers on our website. So in the interest of time, we will only offer brief introductions during the panels. Our speakers on this panel will be Congressman Will Hurd, who represented the 23rd District of Texas until this year and served on the House Intelligence Committee. He focused a lot of energy on artificial intelligence and cybersecurity in particular. Previously, he was an undercover CIA agent and officer overseas as well as in the US, so he comes with multiple valuable perspectives. We'll also hear from Dr. Megan O'Sullivan, professor at the Harvard Kennedy School. Previously, Dr. O'Sullivan served in the White House as Deputy National Security Advisor for Iraq and Afghanistan under President George W. Bush. She's also a Brookings alumna. Rounding out our panel is my colleague, Dr. Suzanne Maloney. She's Vice President for Foreign Policy here at Brookings. Suzanne has advised Democratic and Republican administrations on Iran policy and served as a member of the State Department's policy planning staff. Our moderator will be Brookings President John Allen, who was a retired four-star Marine Corps general. His commands included extensive time in Iraq and as commander of all NATO and US forces in Afghanistan. He subsequently led the security dialogue for the Israeli-Palestinian peace process and as President Barack Obama's special presidential envoy to the global coalition to counter ISIL. Thank you again for joining us. And without further ado, I'll turn the virtual floor back over to John.
Natan, thank you for those great comments and warm introductions to our dear friends. Congressman Hurd, Dr. O'Sullivan. It's great to have you back at Brookings. And Suzanne Maloney, our Brookings Vice President and Director of the Foreign Policy Program. It's wonderful to have you all with us today. And I have a series of questions. We'll go till about 40 minutes past the hour. And let me ask the first question, turning straight to that. It's for the whole panel. And we'll go first to Megan, and then to Will, and then to Suzanne. Now, the Middle East has long been a central focus of American foreign policy, but much has changed in the region over the last decade since the so-called Arab Spring and all the turmoil that followed. And we have experienced significant, not turmoil necessarily, but significant change in the United States with respect to our views on the Middle East. So to start, let me again ask you all, please, to give us your sense, to look out across the Middle East and North Africa in early 2021. And what do you identify as America's top priorities now, please?
Thank you. And it's great to be back here with Brookings and great to be here with some good friends and people whose views I really respect on this and many other issues. I think let me just begin by where you started is the Middle East actually a priority for the United States, for the Biden administration? And I think that many analysts there impulsive responses, no, it's not going to be a high priority for the Biden administration. And I think it's clear that there's an imperative now for the Biden administration to focus on events at home, to focus on getting the coronavirus under wraps, and really to focus on developments in Asia. I think there's a clear consensus among the foreign policy community. That's where the largest imperatives lie, along with transnational threats, be it climate or pandemics or other issues. So I think it's clear that the Biden administration hopes to have a more modest Middle East agenda or policy than its previous or its predecessors, the Obama administration, the Bush administration. But I think even if we look at a more modest approach in the Middle East, it's still going to be quite a challenging set of items in the inbox. There's a lot of issues. I know we'll touch on some of them. I'll just list a couple that I think are going to be the high priorities, but others here can expound on them even more explicitly. First, and as I think is quite clear from the early weeks of the Biden administration, is this recalibrating the relationship with Iran, most specifically curbing its nuclear ambitions. Suzanne is really my go-to person on that, so I won't say anything more about that. Secondly, I would say actually building on the Abraham Accords that the Trump administration helped birth really has resulted in a fundamental change in the region and a positive one from the perspective of American interests. Third, I would mention just the relationship with Saudi Arabia. This is also clear from the outset. It was clear from the campaign that the Biden administration wanted to recalibrate its relationship with Saudi Arabia, not sever it by any stretch of the imagination, but to reintegrate human rights into that relationship and to really put an increased focus on Yemen, as we saw in some of the early announcements and the appointment of Tim Lenderking as the special envoy for Yemen. I'd be remiss if not mentioning Afghanistan and Iraq, because I do think, although there's a lot of fatigue around those issues, that, particularly on Afghanistan, this is a moment where if the Biden administration doesn't devote some calories to this issue, it is on track to really go down the drain and to come back and bite the United States again. And so I think that is going to demand some focus. And Iraq is, is a country that fortunately isn't in our headlines as much as it used to be, but still there's some fragility that the United States needs to pay attention to in order to stave off more challenging problems down the road.
Terrific answer. And I love your priorities, in particular, some calorie dedication to Afghanistan. We've got to do that. Will, your thoughts, please.
Sure. I'm currently teaching a class at University of Chicago, and I'm trying to be like Dr. O'Sullivan, right? One of the things I'm talking about how politics is getting in the way in national security strategy, which requires me to talk to the students about what is our national security strategy. And when you look back, even going all the way back to Ronald Reagan, our objectives have been roughly the same. But sometimes we don't always clearly articulate that. And number one is to prevent catastrophic attack against the U.S. homeland and to protect our citizens abroad. We must remember that. It also is about avoiding a global economic crisis. We talk about stopping the proliferation of WMD, preventing infectious diseases from growing. Okay, we've not done a very good job on that. And then limit the consequences of failing states. And also dealing with climate change, but also energy independence at the same time. So how do those things translate in the various areas around the world? And then how does that translate specifically in the Middle East? And so that means you have to deal with Afghanistan and Iraq. We can't ignore them. These are things that we shouldn't have arbitrary timelines on getting out of. And I'm sure we can get deeper into those conversations. The conversations with our Sunni Arab partners is going to be driven by the issue of Iran, and I'm sure we're going to have a large debate on that. I don't believe you can trust the Iranians, and seeking a deal just for a deal's sake is the wrong way to go. And this is one area that I think we have to be steadfast. But a broader issue here that hasn't gotten enough conversation is the dynamic between us and China and working with our allies. Some of our great partners in the Middle East are saying, don't make us choose between the US and China, because they're implying we're probably not going to like what the answer may be. And so part of what we forget is, what is our economic national security strategy in these areas? Why don't we have a more robust plan on how to address this? OPIC is doing their thing, or whatever the new name of OPIC is. USAID is doing their thing. John, you know better than anybody, we have a clear national defense strategy. Dr. O'Sullivan can talk about how the national security strategy has been developed, but our economic national security strategy, we need to have one, and it needs to be robust in order to counter the One Belt, One Road initiative of the Chinese, because we're not going to like the consequences. And if one of our natural interests is the growth of freedom throughout the world, this means we got to make sure that we're developing technologies and exporting technologies that, especially around artificial intelligence, that apply to the ethics that is supportive of freedom, not the ethics driven by a totalitarian regime like the Chinese. So those are some of the things that I think we're going to have to deal with, and it's going to be interesting to see how this unfolds.
Thank you, Will. Terrific comments on China. And who would have ever thought that in the Middle East, as opposed to East Asia, our friends and allies would be saying, don't make us choose about China. But that's where we are today. Suzanne, please.
Thanks so much, John. And I want to thank all of you for joining us here today, and especially to my two co-panelists who really done a masterful job, I think, in outlining the core priorities for the United States in the Middle East. I couldn't improve upon it, but let me just add a couple of points of perhaps nuance. One is to point out that, despite the fact that the Biden administration does appear determined not to get dragged into the Middle East, as I think there was an anonymous quote in today's Politico suggesting the Middle East has a way of dragging us in. What happens in the region rarely stays in the region. And so I think it's highly unlikely that we're going to be able to simply wash our hands of the region. Beyond that, I think we have historic obligations. We have a legacy that is, in fact, if you stretch back the century plus of U.S. engagement with the countries and peoples of the Middle East, is in fact quite a positive one. And we have been seen as a source of important values and important independence. And that, I think, is unchanging despite the increased frictions that have evolved in the post 9/11 era. We are now in a different era. I think with the eruption of the pandemic and the shift in terms of U.S. priorities, as the Biden administration has articulated, there are core interests that they must attend to regarding the efforts to try to prevent the next pandemic, to deal with the economic recession around the world that has been provoked by these circumstances, the climate crisis, racial justice at home. This is going to be an administration that is going to focus on the domestic home front. But that doesn't mean we simply walk away from those commitments, from the record of service that we have to the region. And it doesn't mean that we can simply abandon our interests and efforts across the broader Middle East. And so both Megan and Will have cited Iran, have cited Saudi Arabia as core policy interests for the administration. Like them, I hope that the administration will continue to focus on conflict resolution and good governance in both Afghanistan and Iraq. And I do hope that we will also think about the great power competition that we're experiencing, not just with China, but also importantly with Russia, which has emerged, I think, as the most salient outside power in the Middle East, and one whose interests and objectives there are in no way, I think, consistent with American values or with the peace and prosperity that the peoples of the Middle East hunger for.
Thank you, Suzanne. Let me come to Megan to follow up on comments that both Will and Suzanne have made. And it's the great power competition that we see with Russia and China and the United States. And as this administration seeks to create a policy about great power competition in the region, do you have a view on that?
Sure, and I'm very glad that both Suzanne and Congressman Hurd mentioned this, because I do think this is a new dynamic and one that really should shape the lens through which we view the Middle East. I think some analysts or observers might say, well, with a focus on great power competition, maybe this means the Middle East kind of gets less attention. I actually think the opposite argument is even more compelling, because basically we know the Middle East has a lot of overt conflicts, a lot of latent conflicts, and all of those present opportunities for China, Russia, and others to get involved, to project power. So I think the risks of domestic or internal to the region conflicts being internationalized are greater than they've ever been, and that plays into the great power competition. I also think there's the reality that although we may like to think that what we do in Afghanistan or other places in the Middle East doesn't affect how the rest of the world looks at us, it's certainly just not the case. Our, reputation for credibility and reliability as a partner and as a great power really is, it's global. So if we look at the red line case back in the Obama administration, the failure to kind of make good on that, setting a red line, the use of WMD in Syria against the Assad regime, the failure to hold Assad accountable for that actually reverberated throughout the world. It certainly made an impact on our Asian allies and others. So I think we have to keep that in mind. So really what it comes down to, I think, is some really big questions about when we look at our approach to the Middle East, what is the new way in which we frame and view our objectives and our, the tasks that we hold ourselves accountable to? And I think, if we look at it through the lens of great power competition, it really does underscore some of our ongoing missions. It basically means things like protecting, sea lanes actually becomes even more important, and establishing and maintaining our naval primacy in the Gulf becomes even more important in the context of great power competition, as well as keeping Russia and China from becoming really the diplomatic power brokers like we've seen in Syria. We don't want to see that replicated throughout the region. So there's a whole host of things we could talk about, but I just would underscore how the Middle East could be really a central landscape for this great power competition unfolding.
Well, that was a very important point you made about dominating the sea lines of communications. And our Navy has done that for many, many years. And it's not just the Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz. It's also the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb, which is an extraordinarily important choke point as well. And Will, your comment about artificial intelligence, as we know, these technologies, when they're applied, are a reflection of the values of those countries. Here's a chance, as we continue the process of America advocating on behalf of artificial intelligence and emerging technologies, to have those be reflective of our national values, as opposed to how the Chinese typically apply them. If I could, let me come back to Dr. O'Sullivan. President Biden has elevated the issue of climate, appointing Secretary John Kerry to be the climate envoy, and he promises an aggressive whole of government approach to tackle the climate crisis. Now, meanwhile, you've written about the abundance of new energy supplies and how that has left the United States less reliant on Middle East oil and gas. So let me ask, please, what will this combination of an aggressive approach to the climate crisis and lessened reliance on imported energy, what will that mean for the U.S. relationship with the region?
Sure. Let me just, again, I don't want to dominate this here, but let me just put kind of this in two baskets. First is, is the quality and the nature of American diplomacy going to change now that climate is going to be a central pillar of American foreign policy? So not just towards the Middle East, but in the rest of the world. And I'd say if the Biden administration is successful in making climate a central pillar, we are going to see a very different kind of American foreign policy. It used to be that climate was an issue. There were climate specialists. They engaged, concertedly in climate fora and climate dialogues. But now we're talking about every American diplomat in general being a climate advocate, talking about decarbonization, integrating it into the highest level meetings. This is going to be a change in the nature of American diplomacy, and it is undoubtedly going to need to squeeze out other priorities if the Biden administration makes good on this pledge. The broader question about what does this elevation of climate change mean for the Middle East? And I think a lot of people might think, well, it means the Middle East is less important. The world's moving away from fossil fuels. America already was just on the cusp of really reaching, meeting its own net oil needs right before the pandemic. I actually think it's a lot more complex than that. The Middle East will demand attention in this climate agenda because there are so many players there that actually have the potential to be spoilers in executing this agenda, in bringing down the price of oil, making it much harder for other alternative sources of energy to be competitive. So that's one factor. And I think this is going to require engagement by the Biden administration with countries of the Middle East on climate. And to be fair to these countries, many of them, Saudi Arabia and the UAE in particular, have demonstrated a real interest in actually working on climate. The UAE is actually debating whether it should adopt a net carbon neutral target, as many other countries have in the world. So these are not countries that are not seriously thinking about this. And the last point I'll make is this question of, I think too many people feel that moving in the right direction on climate means that the world will no longer use oil. If you look at scenarios, energy scenarios that are climate compatible across the board, from the International Renewable Energy Agency to the International Energy Agency in Paris, you will see that all of these scenarios incorporate not as much oil as we're using today, but a significant amount. And what that means for the Middle East is that the Middle East is going to be more important in the world's energy consumption as it relates to oil, because we'll be using less oil and we'll be using it with carbon capture technologies, ideally. But more of the oil we use will come from the Middle East. Less of it will come from all these other countries that are higher cost producers. So the Middle East will continue to be important when it comes to energy. Sorry to go on so long, but there are many complexities I wanted to tease out.
That last point is really important, and I think would be lost on most observers of this debate and this conversation. So thank you for raising that. Suzanne, let me turn to you, please. This is about Iran. The Trump administration left the 2015 JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, negotiated to contain Iran's nuclear program, and pursued a policy of maximum pressure on Iran. You've, of course, been a great student of that and very vocal on these subjects. Last week, the Biden administration agreed to meet with Iranian counterparts to discuss steps which would bring both sides back into compliance with the JCPOA. And of course, we wake up this morning to hear that the administration is actually talking to the Iranians on the hostage issue, which is a very important issue as well. So my question is that the right approach? Should Washington, with respect to the JCPOA, seek to move back to the original deal as quickly as possible, or should the administration seek to use the current impasse over the deal to negotiate a, quote, longer and stronger deal, as Secretary Blinken promised in his confirmation testimony? A lot there, sorry.
No, that's a terrific and very important question. And I appreciate you getting right to the heart of the matter, which is, which direction do we go? This is the subject, of course, of a lot of debate around Washington and around the world. I want to take one step back, though. I think let's think about what our real goal is here. There are many, and especially around this debate about what kind of deal are we seeking and how do we seek it, who focus on the deal as the document as being the objective of U.S. policy. I think that's the wrong lens. I think the appropriate lens is how do we best deter Iran from making further advances on a pathway to nuclear weapons capability, and how do we best deter other policies that Iran undertakes that are deeply destabilizing to the region and deeply threatening to its own population and to U.S. interests and allies and partners around the world. What's the best way to go about that? Obviously, diplomacy has to be at the core of what we do. And so in that respect, I think it's quite positive that the Biden administration has indicated its willingness to talk to the Iranians. That has been a staple of U.S. policy since the 1979 revolution, with only brief and relatively unsuccessful exceptions. So diplomacy has to be key and core to the way that we approach this problem, rather than trying to predetermine the outcome of a JCPOA return versus a longer or stronger deal. What we need is a policy that is aimed at getting a longer and stronger array of deterrents to Iran's most objectionable behaviors. I want to put a little bit of emphasis on the question of urgency. The Iranians, of course, have set a deadline for removing their implementation of the additional protocol, which enables snap inspections by the International Atomic Energy Agency. This is a tool by the Iranians to try to push the Biden administration into a suboptimal return to some kind of an agreement with them. I think that the administration is rightly resisting it, and I hope that they continue. We need to avoid the Iranians using brinksmanship to try to force some kind of outcome upon the world, which enables the regime to move closer to its own objectives, rather than ensuring that we're undertaking diplomacy that is carefully thought through. The final point I want to make is that Iran is not just a nuclear issue, as I've suggested. There are real issues of concern about the way Iran conducts itself around the region. We talked a little bit about the conflicts in the early set of discussions that we've had this morning, the conflicts that have roiled the Middle East. Whether it's Syria or Yemen, Iran has played an integral role in fueling violence that has not just destabilized those countries, not just led to humanitarian catastrophes, but obviously had implications for Europe and the wider world with the flow of refugees that has left those countries and others because, in part, of Iran's destabilizing activities. We also know that Iran's treatment of its own population is of real and deep concern. And as you noted, John, the proclivity to take hostages as a way of trying to gain leverage with the international community is a uniquely horrific aspect of Iranian policy, again, that has lasted now for more than 4 decades. So while I would favor a longer and stronger deal, I think our goal now should be diplomacy with Iran to try to deter its worst behaviors, that we should undertake it in a way that has proven most successful, that is in close coordination with allies and partners around the world. And that policy shouldn't just be focused on the nuclear issue, it has to be focused on the broad array of concerns about Iran.
Excellent. That comprehensive approach is definitely the way to go. Will, let me come to you, please. This is also a time when American domestic politics has grown increasingly partisan and in many ways just toxic. It's often used to be said that the politics stop at the water's edge. But we see that the dramatic foreign policy shifts between administrations have unfortunately made the partisan rancor in our government today far more difficult for presidents to negotiate and to navigate through. We've seen this president return to the Paris Climate Accord. We've seen this president talk about another conversation with Iran. But as we go forward, as we seek to increase the sense of reliability of the United States with our allies, how should we be thinking about partisanship at home as it affects our ability to secure our interests abroad?
I think General Mattis, I think it was in 2017, he was testifying in front of Congress, and he said, in essence, I'm messing up his quote, that comedy in Congress would be the equivalent of like 10 battleships in the military. And look, this concern that our allies and even our enemies have about the unreliability of the United States of America is driven because foreign policy shouldn't be done by executive order, right? Now, as you said, John, it had to because you can't get agreements within Congress. One of the things I'm excited about this year is Greg Meeks and Mike McCall. These are two great members of Congress, both incredibly smart, great understanding of the issues around the world, and you're probably going to see them be the most bipartisan committee. And so I hope everybody starts following their lead, and I'm looking forward to what Greg has to say later today, I believe, as part of this presentation. But ultimately, Congress is a co-equal branch of government. And we need to make sure that the executive branch is engaging with the senior leaders of Congress on these important issues. I also think one of the problems that we have is that we need to strengthen our diplomatic corps. I think starting since Bill Clinton, a lot of decisions were being made at the White House when we should have our ambassadors on the ground making some of those decisions. And if you strengthen the ability of the president's representative on the ground to get things done, I think that's going to help individual members of Congress look at a particular expert on the ground. Ryan Crocker always said that if you had more wingtips and pumps on the ground, meaning more diplomats and intelligence officers, you can prevent boots on the ground. I'm a firm believer in that. And so while that may sound disconnected, that strengthening the diplomatic corps is going to improve Congress working together, but it allows members of Congress to see an outside person that is the expert on the region rather than someone who's pushing a political agenda. Now, but it's going to be hard, and ultimately it's a structural problem within our system. When 92% of elections are decided in primaries versus general elections, you're going to talk to the more extreme side. But nothing big has ever been done in the United States of America for a lasting amount of time unless it was done together. And so I hope we're going to see a move back to that. I hope the Joe Biden, who was the deal maker in the Senate, is the kind of a president we see. I think he's making those efforts, but that may require him to go beyond the leadership of both houses and work with rank and file members on a lot of these issues that we're talking about here today, which there's a number of members that care about these things.
Well, that's a great answer. And I know that this administration, and I know there's great interest within the Congress as well in a bipartisan way to work together to try to link our domestic policy agenda with our foreign policy agenda. And you made a very important point. We do not thank our foreign service and our aid professionals, our USAID professionals, our development professionals. We do not thank them enough because they are in so many ways the leading edge of American influence. Mm-hmm. You talked about battleships, aircraft carriers, divisions of troops, those are important. But in the end, the leading edge of America's influence in the world is our foreign service and our development professionals. And we just don't thank them enough. And thank you for making that linkage and raising it.
Yeah, and John, let me add on that. We need them to be engaging in these international organizations, right? It's not just about participating in these international organizations. It's about leading in these international organizations. When I was posted to India, it was when President Bush was redefining that bilateral relationship, and we were getting ready to make some major announcements. And at the UN, they were still talking about being part of the non-aligned movement and banging us over the head. And we were like, oh, we're going to let that go because we know in the bilateral relationship it's okay. Some of that mentality needs to stop, and we need to actually take active roles in these organizations, because what are the Chinese doing in these international settings, these international rule setting bodies? Now they're driving it to their benefit, and so if we have a strong diplomatic corps, it's going to help us, and our allies, especially in the Middle East, are going to see that as us reasserting our role in this global order.
You couldn't be more right, and our re-emphasis now on the UN. Rejoining the World Health Organization, rejoining the Human Rights Council, all of those things are opportunities, as you say, properly will, for us to exert leadership, the kind of leadership that the world really needs. Dr. O'Sullivan, Megan, let me come back to you, please, for this question. We saw an early glimpse of the new administration's approach to the Middle East when President Biden announced the end of U.S. support for offensive operations in the Saudi-led conflict in Yemen. Could you talk, please, to what role the U.S. can play in resolving this conflict, which has produced, frankly, one of the world's worst humanitarian crises? In Washington, is Washington engaged in a reset with Saudi Arabia? And what will this mean in practice if, in fact, it is?
Great, thank you. I'd like to just say one word on building on Congressman Hurd's really good comments about the domestic considerations going into foreign policy. I think we should also acknowledge that the Biden administration has been very explicit about trying to reconnect the domestic audience with the foreign policy of the United States. So we've heard the phrase foreign policy for the middle class. I think we're still all trying to figure out what that means, but clearly there's a real need to explain to Americans why our engagement overseas benefits them at home. And I think that underscores and will underscore a lot of the efforts that the Biden administration will do in the future. And I think that is constructive to really try harder to make that explicit linkage. On Saudi Arabia, I don't know if I use the word reset, but maybe it's appropriate. I think that it's clear that the Biden administration wants to, as I used the word, to recalibrate its relationship with the Saudis, and it's announced that it's kind of undertaken a review of this relationship, took a few first steps in moving in that direction. Then candidate Biden used some very harsh rhetoric towards the Saudis during the campaign, saying that we're going to treat Saudi Arabia like the pariah state that it is, and that's a quote. I think the reality is going to be less harsh. I think this is at heart a team that is pragmatic in nature, and it knows that it needs Saudi Arabia to be a more constructive actor in the region. And the way to get that to happen is not by insulating or isolating Saudi Arabia from the United States. I also think that we're going to see, and we already have begun to see, that the Saudis are very sensitive to this. I think they enjoyed their relationship with the Trump administration. They knew they benefited from this very special relationship where their internal dynamics pretty much went unquestioned, and they had extraordinary access to the powers that be, and in the White House in particular. But they knew that that was an unusual situation, and they knew that another administration was going to handle them a bit differently. And we've seen, just initial things that the Saudis have done have indicated that they're looking for a way to engage with the U.S. more, to be perceived as a more positive player in the region. We saw the release of a very prominent human rights activist in the early days of the Biden administration. That clearly was a signal to the Biden administration. We hear you. We're interested in listening and working with you. But I do think it is going to be different. I think that Saudi Arabia is going to be more of part of the regional landscape than a unique and precious relationship on its own. In terms of Yemen, I do think that the United States has an important role to play there. I wouldn't necessarily say it's in the power of the United States to solve this problem per se, but I think influencing Saudi Arabia's behavior is real, and these decisions not to sell offensive weaponry, I think, are important and will get the Saudis' attention and make them kind of recalibrate, just exactly how they're going to move forward in this conflict. But I think I was really pleased, as I mentioned before, that announcement was coupled with the appointment of someone who really knows the region as well. Tim Lenderking has lived and worked in Saudi Arabia and in the region as a whole. I've known him in that context for a long time, and someone who will be exclusively really dedicated to trying to find a diplomatic effort that is more fruitful with Yemen. So I think that's a really positive development. And in the very short term, I think the Biden administration has taken some steps to acknowledge that the humanitarian crisis needs to be forefront on the global agenda. So delisting the Houthis has made it more possible for humanitarian aid to flow. And I think that has to be very, very high in the list of priorities when it comes to Yemen policy or policy towards the Arabian Peninsula.
Great answer. That delisting of the Houthis was a very interesting move by the administration, actually. Let's turn now to some audience questions. Megan, you mentioned the advent of the Abraham Accords, and I think those of us who've watched the region for a long time never believed that we'd ever see something like this, and it's a very positive development on the whole. but it has created a dynamic about the two-state solution and the future of Israeli-Palestinian peace talks. Let me start with you, Megan, if I may, and then go to Will and Suzanne, if you've got thoughts on that, please.
Sure. As I mentioned, I do think the Abraham Accords are a very significant development, but I think they're still holding out a lot of promise, and a lot of promise that is yet to be realized. So we can't kind of assume that these dynamics are going to continue and unfold in a positive direction without real encouragement. It certainly has been good for many actors, but the Palestinians is not among these, as it has really indicated to the Palestinians and to others that Israelis and Arabs can move forward positively in their relationship without addressing the Palestinian issue. So I think it has really put the Palestinian issue more on the back burner. I think that is appropriate for the moment, in the sense that I think before engaging on some additional diplomatic efforts to resolve the issue between the Israelis and the Palestinians, there has to be some prospect for a different outcome. So I don't know if that's different leadership, a different vision, a different strategy in terms of how we're going to get to a better outcome. But I don't think, even if it's not, high on the list of priorities, I don't think we can just wave it off the list of important things that need to be addressed in the Middle East. Even though many of these rulers in the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan, other places, hopefully in the coming months and years will normalize relationships with Israel, a lot of the Arab street itself is not really reconciled to a new relationship. And I think that for really bringing Middle East societies along with these changes will require more action on the Palestinian front as well.
Thank you. Will, do you have a thought on it?
Sure. Look, the new leadership is needed in Palestine, and because can we trust? Abu Mazen does not have the juice that he once had. Who is the right successor? And you can't negotiate a broad deal unless you have a individual that everybody trusts can deliver. And so until that next level of leadership, is selected, identified, determined, I think seeing any future success on that issue is unlikely.
Suzanne, thank you, Will.
I'll just add the obvious, which is that any kind of normalization is a net positive for a region that has been riven by such conflict and such abnormal conditions of the impasse between states and peoples for so many years. But as Megan suggested and Will expanded upon, it doesn't resolve the core problem for the Palestinian people. And that has to be a priority, even as the administration is busy with many other issues and priorities. I'm heartened by the fact that our former colleague from Brookings, Hadi Amr, who's now over at the Department of State as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Israel-Palestine, is someone who really does understand the nature of the conflict and understands and has an excellent relationship with political actors on both sides of the conflict. And I hope that he will have some success in ensuring that we don't simply turn a blind eye to the ongoing situation for the Palestinian people. This is an important issue. And as you suggested, John, the longer we leave it unaddressed, the more difficult it gets to resolve.
Well, we'll probably hear some of that with the next speaker, Yair Lapid, who will be joining us to talk about how the Knesset sees the world and how the opposition now sees the world as well in Israel. I'm going to combine the next two questions. The first was about the absence, in many respects, of holding our Middle East friends, partners, adversaries accountable for human rights. The U.S. did not pursue aggressively human rights in the Middle East during the last administration, but this administration intends to embrace this in a very real way. And if it pushes certain countries too much on human rights, to what extent can they or will they begin to turn to China or Russia? Here we circle back with this great power relationship and dynamic. And which countries in the region, aside from the obvious U.S. adversaries like Iran or Syria, have already begun to show an interest in doing this? Let me go first to you, Suzanne, and then we'll go to Will and then Megan.
Look, I think it's absolutely fundamental that we uphold our values in pursuing our interests across the world. And that's especially true in the Middle East, where there has been a history of some sense among peoples of the region of rank hypocrisy, that we're deeply critical of Iran's violation of human rights and less critical of the violations by many of our allies. I see this administration adopting a much more balanced approach. It is often very difficult to criticize your allies publicly. Where I think we have seen U.S. officials have real impact is by ensuring that this is understood as a universal aspect of U.S. policy, and simply in their private conversations with individual leaders and representatives of partners and allies around the world, ensuring that we, in fact, raise these issues consistently. I know that was true for Condoleezza Rice when she was Secretary of State. Essentially, every time she met with anyone from the Middle East, irrespective with that country, she wanted to be sure that she was talking about the human rights situations, particularly where there were significant concerns. And so I think that as we routinize this, as we make it an important aspect of our policy, we don't have to open up a crisis or a conflict with every leadership. We simply hold them to the standards that we hold our adversaries to, and that will, over time, have an ameliorative effect.
Megan, your thoughts, please?
Yes, I agree completely with Suzanne here that we will see this administration raising these issues more systematically, and that will have an effect. This is not going to be new, as Suzanne said, to many of these countries, because previous administrations have taken this stance that what goes on inside a country is of interest and importance to the United States. And this is very different than the approach the Trump administration took in the last 4 years. One thing I would add on is the point that we're noting the 10-year mark of the Arab revolutions. And what is different about the Middle East today than 10 years ago? And I would say that it's hard to paint with a broad brush, but in many countries, there is a more active civil society for the United States to engage with. And that is something that America should do very robustly in trying to shore up advocates of rights, of civil society, better standards for accountability, all of these things, which in the past might have proven or been viewed as a little bit threatening to the regimes in power. But I think there's a lot more to work with than there was 10 years ago. And I think that should be a significant part of how the Biden administration thinks about how it's going to underscore the support for our values in its Middle East policy. So it's not just raising issues with leaders, but it's also engaging with people in those societies. We've heard President Biden say on many occasions, it's not the example of power, but the power of our example. So there's also a whole element of how we need to demonstrate that we're willing to take a critical look at our own democracy. We're willing to analyze it and decide, hopefully collectively, what we need to do to shore up our institutions that have been under strain. I think that is also an important piece of being an advocate for democracy worldwide.
Will, let me come to you on a slightly separate question. I know you probably have something to add on that one, but this is a good one. Megan talked about this administration needing to do a little investment of calories with respect to Afghanistan, and I know that you've had a lot of experience on the ground there. What might you see as a shift of this administration with respect to Afghanistan and the agreement that it signed back in February of last year with the Taliban? We just had a major event last week here at Brookings on the future situation of women in Afghanistan if we see this peace agreement exercised on schedule. How might we see a shift? How might this administration shift from the current agreement that it has with the Taliban?
Sure. And to the previous question, briefly,
Sure.
The United States of America has become an exceptional nation, not because of what we have taken, but because of what we have given. And it's not just giving economic support, but it's also leadership and our values. And so if we're not maintaining our values, then that's a problem. Now I get criticized because I'm critical of my own party when we, go away from our values, but we should hold ourselves, our friends, our family to higher standards. And so this is something that we should be able to do, and it can be done in a way that doesn't impact the relationship. But guess what? There is somebody else out there being like, hey, America's being unreasonable with you. Why don't you come with us? Because we don't care about that. That shouldn't deter us from still sticking to our values. When it comes to Afghanistan, which is fascinating, is that so this peace deal is not a peace deal. Okay, I've been against it. I've been against it. And when you still have the Taliban killing people and our allies, how is that stopping actions? Now, what's fascinating, this is kind of, things are coming full circle. I was in Afghanistan when the Obama administration came in. The idea of talking to the Taliban under the Bush administration was an absolute no-go. That conversation really began with the Obama administration. And so the fact that we got to a point where we're engaging with the Taliban, and now folks that came from that administration are probably going to pull out, which I think they should. We're going to be in Afghanistan for a long time. And I think the things we need to be doing in Afghanistan is helping improve the Afghan Air Force so they can constantly have air superiority over the Taliban. We know they can be an effective fighting force. We need to educate the American people about how many resources and people are actually there. The loss of life and the amount of money that's being spent there is not as much as everybody thinks it is. Hey, guess what? We still have troops in Japan and Germany. We're not talking about pulling those kind of troops out.
And
so
Korea.
Let's stop. And Korea, yeah. So let's stop with the arbitrary timelines, and I hope that's what the administration does. And bottom line, we need to recognize, look, so when everybody, and you alluded to this, when everybody talks about, was it worth it? I was in the CIA before 9/11, and the feeling that everybody had on September 10th, before, nervous about something was going to happen, then it happened, and then the worry about something else going to happen. The point of being in Afghanistan is preventing in a place where people can train, equip, and attack the homeland. That issue is always going to be something on the table. We have to commit resources to that region. Oh, and by the way, millions of girls are being educated over the last 10 years. That's what's going to help that country come out of the 5th century. And so we can get it right. We got to play a little bit tougher role. We gotta, I think we gotta start using the Jirga process a little bit better. We probably made some mistakes early on in how the original Constitution or the current Constitution was designed. Those are going to be some tough questions that the Biden administration is going to have.
We're running a little short on time. Megan, would you like to come in behind Will on this? And then we'll go around the horn very quickly with one final piece of advice that you'd like to offer to the Biden administration. So Megan, please.
Do you want me to come in on Afghanistan or on? Okay, so just briefly, I appreciate everything that Congressman Hurd said, and I do think that the right thing to do here would be to rejigger our approach towards Afghanistan. For all the things we can say about the February 2020 agreement between the U.S. and the Taliban, I think there's an agreement. This wasn't a peace accord. This was basically setting the stage for what was hoped to be an intra-Afghan dialogue. So that agreement, our withdrawal, including the full withdrawal on May 1st, is supposed to be conditions-based. And one of those conditions is bringing down violence. And another condition is engaging meaningfully in a dialogue with the Afghan government. And of course, the Taliban has not attacked the United States since that agreement was signed, but other levels of violence have gone up. And that is clearly not in the spirit of that February 2020 agreement. I was part of a congressionally mandated task force on Afghanistan chaired by General Joe Dunford and Senator Ayotte and Nancy Lindbergh. And we just came out with our report. And we really do encourage the Biden administration to say, look, the conditions have not been met for us to make this May 1st withdrawal. So we need to reset the expectations around our withdrawal and continue to try to see that this intra-Afghan dialogue can produce something, because this is the first time that the Taliban has talked to the Afghan government in this 20-year 70-year history. So, that is something we shouldn't let go quickly as well.
Thank you very much. And we are short of time. Let me just ask each one of you, if you have one piece of advice on the Middle East to offer this new administration, what would that be? Starting with you, Suzanne, please.
My advice is specific to Iran, but I think it applies to the entire region. As with most things, it's impossible to do to get policy that's right, that's fast, and that's cheap. You have to pick. The Biden administration really needs to focus on getting the policy right, not on doing it fast or doing it on the cheap.
Thank you. Will, please.
Be nice with nice guys and tough with tough guys, right? President Obama was nice with tough guys, and President Trump was tough with nice guys. Let's do it. Let's be nice with nice guys, tough with tough guys, and we'll be okay.
I'm going to get a transcript of that and post it next to my desk. And Megan O'Sullivan, please, last word.
I would, my advice would be, do not equate ending forever wars with withdrawing U.S. troops completely from the Middle East. That essentially, the ending forever wars is more a question of getting the right relationship between the US and our partners on the ground. And in many cases, we were really beginning to get there with a very, very modest US footprint that enabled host countries, and you know this, John, better than anyone else, enabling our indigenous partners to take the fight to where it needed to go. We don't talk about a forever war in the context of Japan or Germany or Korea, and we still have, as Congressman Hurd pointed out, a lot of troops on the ground, many, many more, 10 times more in Korea than we have in Afghanistan. So we need to not equate removing all of those troops with ending forever wars, that we have a different model that after 20 years of trying very hard and failing on many occasions, we have found a model that seems to be able to uphold our interest with a minimal physical commitment. And that, I think, is more in the US interest than simply being able to declare that all Americans are back at home.
Well, I can't thank you all enough for the wonderful vision that you've exposed us all to today, your thoughts. It's just wonderful conversation. Dr. Megan O'Sullivan, Brookings alum, welcome home. It's good to see you again. Congressman Will Hurd, great bipartisan leader in the Congress and a great leader within the CIA. It's wonderful to see you, sir. There's so much more service we need from you as well. And Vice President and Program Director Suzanne Maloney of the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings. Thank you all so much for joining us for this great opening panel of this conference. And we'll hear next from the leader of the opposition in the Knesset, Yair Lapid. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Good day. Be safe.
Good morning, all, and welcome to member of Knesset Yair Lapid. I should say welcome back to the Brookings stage, although this time it's a virtual stage, of course. A very brief introduction. Yair Lapid is chairman of the centrist Yesh Atid party, and he's the leader of the opposition in the Israeli Knesset, previously Minister of Finance and a member of the Security Cabinet. Israel has had no less than 3 national elections in the past 2 years, and I do not envy him and his staff. They are facing a 4th on March 23rd. It's really deep in unprecedented territory. Past 3 elections, you ran as part of the Blue and White coalition. Now you had your own party again, Yesh Atid, currently polling as the 2nd largest in the Knesset behind Prime Minister Netanyahu. So besides a welcome, if I may, I'm going to jump already straight into questions and ask you, can you tell us, not in terms of domestic politics and policy where there's a lot of difference between you, in terms of foreign policy, could you tell us a little bit, what is the difference between you and Prime Minister Netanyahu in practical terms?
Okay. First of all, hi Nathan, good to be here. Few issues, I guess. I mean, there are things we agree upon, like how to deal or the general approach towards the Iranian nuclear deal, which we'll probably get into pretty soon. I would say the basic differences would go on the Palestinian issue, in which I believe we need to move forward on the two-state solution. We need to go through a regional conference, but the end goal should be two states. I would say Prime Minister Netanyahu has been playing with the idea, but looking back at his 15 years in office, obviously he's not going to do anything. So, I mean, by now we know that because he didn't do anything so far, thus far. And the kind of coalition he can have will prevent him from moving forward. I believe this is crucial to the future of Israel, that will move forward on the Palestinian issue. Here's where I differ from the Israeli right and from the Israeli left. I differ from the Israeli right in my determination to try and have those two states, one next to another, a very strong Israel next to a demilitarized Palestinian state. I differ from the Israeli left because I do not believe, unfortunately, that this will be the end of conflict. I mean, the big mantra of the Israeli left will always the end of conflict. I think in my lifetime, unfortunately, there will be no end of conflict, but we can have a self-recognized and global recognized Palestinian state next to Israel that has a conflict with Israel on two major issues. One is Jerusalem, because we will not agree to divide Jerusalem, and the other is the right of return, which is unacceptable to us because it's the end of the Jewish majority in Israel, and therefore the end of the Jewish state. So these two issues will be an ongoing conflict between the two states, but it will be a conflict between two countries. And there are countries in the world that has conflicts between them, and will be two more countries like this, but this will be a more dignifying kind of conflict, because it will be between two peoples that has recognized each other. The other issue, I differ from Prime Minister Netanyahu, and I've been criticizing him about this quite a bit, is I think I'm going to do a much better work in making sure Israel goes back, not staying, but goes back to be a bipartisan issue in the United States. I mean, Prime Minister Netanyahu has made the mistake of affiliating himself way too much with the Republican Party, starting with his conflict with President Obama and the administration in 2015, which escalated to his speech in Congress, if you remember. You probably remember. And then in ways becoming some sort of a branch of you know what? No, it's not even the Republican Party. It's a certain part of the Republican Party. I don't think it's the place of an Israeli prime minister, for example, just the other day, singing the obituary of Rush Limbaugh. This is not the kind of politics we should have. What we need, and so we need to go back to create, making Israel acceptable for both sides of the alley, for the Democrats and Republicans as well. So on the side of this, I will add a third, but and quite similar one, a subject which is renewing and making sure we have better relations with the EU, with the Europeans, with the UN, with international establishments. I think these needs to be changed. So this is generally the differences between us.
Thank you. I'd like to unpack that a little bit, if I may. And as you'll be shocked to hear, I'd like to start with Iran. You implicitly criticized a statement by the Israeli chief of staff recently at an INSS conference, where he seemed to give very strident advice to the United States as to what the United States should or should not do. But on substance, I wonder if you actually disagree with what he said. He criticized the JCPOA as a bad deal. He urged the United States not to return to the JCPOA quickly or at all. On the actual substance, is there really much daylight between you and Chief of Staff Kochavi or Prime Minister Netanyahu on the Iran issue?
Well, first of all, I mean, not really, but I'm not wearing any uniforms. And therefore, I mean, I'm allowed to say things that I think he shouldn't have. But here's the thing. There are three basic possibilities. The best of all will be the right agreement. I think, I mean, an improved agreement, which includes the ballistic missiles program, which includes a much better supervision. I don't know, you probably heard that the Iranians has unilaterally declared that they're now getting rid of another chunk of supervision coming from abroad. So there's, I mean, a different sunset clause. There should be, a part of this should deal with the renewed or improved agreement should be, should include some kind of an answer to Iran's involvement in international terror. All these are not in the JCPOA. So this is the best option. Even if you want to move back or start by moving back to the JCPOA, you should have at least a decision made about where you want to go to next. This is what President Macron was trying to tell the world and the Americans. The second best is no agreement but sanctions. I want to remind you again what you know, that the Iranians has agreed to the JCPOA because the Obama administration has tightened the sanctions like no one ever did before. And therefore, this is the right way to go about it. Appeasement was never a good idea with the Iranians because they're the best negotiators maybe in the world. And the third and worse option is a bad agreement. And I think the JCPOA was not a good enough agreement. I think going back, I mean, tying your first and second question, part of the problems that were created or part of the obstacles that were created after the Prime Minister Netanyahu's speech at Congress in 2015 is that we were not even near the table when decisions were made, because the anger and the resentment, justified or not, justified, prevented us from being there. So, you know, even the kind of intelligence only Israel have was not on the table while discussing the details of the JCPOA. So I think that the first goal right now is for us to be around, discussing it with the administration, showing them what we have and what we think, for two reasons. A, because I think we are professionals on this, and B, because we have to remember this is not an academic issue for Israel. I mean, it's an existential threat. If the Iranians will have the Islamic bomb, they will use it. There's only one address it's going, and this is my house in Tel Aviv or my office in Jerusalem. It doesn't matter, by the way, because it's a big enough explosion to destroy them both. As you know, Israel is a very small country. So we need to be there for this, and we need to have the right relations or create or build the right relations. I have a lot of I have high expectations from this administration. I think people like Secretary Blinken and Rob Malley, whom I know from the Obama administration, are the kind of people you want to and you must be able to discuss issues with. So hopefully this is the way we're going to go about it.
Thank you. So you described three possibilities: the possibility of a good deal, the possibility of no deal, essentially a continuation of the maximum pressure campaign, more or less, probably with some Biden changes, and then the possibility of a return to what you consider a bad deal. So I'd like to pause for a moment on the middle ground, which is quite possible that there's no new deal achieved. Do you see maximum pressure as successful? Iran today, by some measures, is closer to a bomb in theory. However, it's also curtailed in terms of very stringent sanctions on its population and its regime. If we continue in this mode, are you relatively calm? Do you think urgency, the United States should feel a sense of urgency, or is maximum pressure more or less succeeding?
Well, listen, none of the options we're discussing are great. And the reason is because we have a regional, it's not a regional superpower, but it certainly is a regional power. Iran is a sophisticated country, great science, that is pushing forward a nuclear program for military use because of very deep religious and very dangerous sentiments. So therefore, we're not discussing good options to begin with. We're just discussing how to try and limit and prevent a terrible thing from happening. Because here's one thing we should all agree upon. The world, especially Israel, but the world or the entire international community cannot afford a nuclear Iran. And this, we need to do everything in our power to prevent this to becomes a military conflict, but it might, and military option is on the table because again, we cannot afford a nuclear Iran. And therefore what we're dealing with is just ways and measures to prevent something horrible from happening. No good is going to come out of this, no matter what, but from the lesser goods, the sanctions are pretty, learning from our past are a pretty efficient tool, at least to delay or to make them reconsider or to bring them back to the table in the right mode. We don't have much time. We're going to have an election in Iran in June. It's also a factor. Some will tell you that a renewed JCPOA is a way to support the moderates in this election. Some will tell you the history of Iran tells you it doesn't matter because they're going to vote like anybody else on domestic issues, mostly the economy. And besides, the supreme leader, Khamenei, is not to be elected. He's there for life. So therefore, yes, the sanctions are not a great tool. It's not, the situation is not great, but it's a tool and should be considered as one.
So thank you. In the interest of time, and our time is very short, so I will turn to the Palestinian issue. A lot of the questions we received online, you'll be surprised to hear, were about that. You will not be surprised to hear, were about that. And you described a difference between you and Prime Minister Netanyahu on support for the two-state solution. Although your version of the two-state solution is quite different from that the Palestinians or even many American administrations have spoken about, in particular on the issue of Jerusalem. I wonder if you could describe a little bit what practically could be done in the near term. As you know better than I, most Israelis are extremely skeptical of a deal with the Palestinians, that it could be possible, and Palestinians are extremely skeptical that one is as well. Can you tell us a little bit what can be done in the short term? If you become prime minister after March, what do you think can be done now?
Well, I've been pushing since 2015 the idea of a regional conference, which will be the beginning of a negotiation. Now, actually, the conditions have improved because of the Abraham Accords, because of the kind of agreements we have now with the Gulf countries, with the Emirate UAE and others, and because of the kind of relationship that is being cautiously built with other Gulf countries. So, the atmosphere towards such a conference is even better than it was when I started discussing this. The problem is the word and the new administration is being as positive as it looks it's going to be, is maybe the right voice to pronounce this, must tell the Palestinians that this is not a zero-sum game. It is not either we get whatever we want, we have ever asked for, or we are not playing ball. It is a negotiation, and therefore there should be some pushing and shoving. And I mean, we will not get everything we want. They will not get whatever they want. The Palestinians has announced. I don't know if you remember this, but President Abbas was elected for 4 years, and this was in 2005. So this is not the real democracy, the way we understand a democracy.
Well, they may be facing elections very soon this year.
And now they're saying we're talking about an election. There's already talks about the cancellation of the coming election for several reasons. But what we need is, I mean, if I'm prime minister, then you have an Israel that is willing to play ball, that is willing to discuss, that is open to suggestions, and wants to come to the table with no preconditions. What we need is Palestinians who understands this is, I mean, you know what? Even the word as they knew it is gone. It's not like the Arab world is now conditioning any signing peace deals with Israel on the Palestinian issue. No, this is not the way it is anymore. We should use this instead. I mean, in a way, the Palestinians can tell themselves, yes, we are angry at the Mohammed bin Ziyad for agreeing to have a deal with Israel, but Israel must understand that now you tend to listen better to your friends than to your foes. And now that we can create some sort of an atmosphere that is pro-agreement and use this new accords as a tool to promote a cautious beginning through a regional conference discussing things. We all know the basic outline. I mean, there are the big blocks. It's the Bush letter to Sharon. It's the Clinton parameters. Yes, and I'm telling you in advance, there will be no real successful compromise on Jerusalem, and there will be no successful compromise on the right of return. And therefore, we should declare those issues as unsolved. And then we need to discuss the possibility of these being unsolved issues between two sovereign countries.
One issue that comes up a lot, and we've received questions on that as well, is the situation in Gaza, of course. Very recently, with Israeli support, a deal has been reached to greatly enhance the energy supply in the Gaza Strip. But as you know, about 2 million people there live in terrible conditions. Two questions really here. Would you try to fundamentally change the situation in Gaza one way or another? We've heard all sorts of suggestions in Israel, one way or another. Would you try to fundamentally change it? And secondly, do you think it is in Israel's long-term interest that Gaza and the West Bank be separate, as some have suggested in government? Or in the long term, do you hope to see one Palestinian government in the Palestinian areas in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip?
Let me start by just saying what is usually neglected in this kind of conversation. What is happening in Gaza is heartbreaking. These are children. I mean, Gaza is young. I mean, demographically, these are children that feels they have no future. This is unemployment. This is hunger sometimes. Now you can say, and we have all said that it's their fault. I mean, nobody forced them to choose and to elect. They elected Hamas, a terrible, violent, Islamic fundamentalist terror organization, to lead them to a terrible nothing. And yet, I mean, even if people make mistakes and nations make mistakes, when suffering is suffering, and my heart goes to every child in Gaza who's afraid of the COVID-19, his people are dying around him. And we need to improve that. And we need, because of humanitarian reasons, we need to make sure Israel's security is not breached. We remember the terror tunnels. We do remember that since the disengagement, since we've left Gaza, more than 15,000 missiles and rockets were fired upon Israeli citizens. So, of course, security is the number one in every country, the number one issue, the security of our people. But if doable, we have to try to improve the life of the people in Gaza in spite of the kind of regime that is running their lives. Having said that, I do believe it is in the best interest of Israel, it's in the best interest of the Palestinians that there will be one leadership for the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, and it should be not Hamas, not terror organization, but the PA as it was before 2005. I hope they've learned that this kind of, terror organizations are never good leaders for nations. And therefore, I hope the Palestinians understand this, that this is a bad idea. This was a terrible idea to elect Hamas into power. And if it's in my hand and there are possibility, again, Israel's security first, the security of our people, the security of the people of the Israeli, I wanted to say the Israeli South, but the last conflict we had, the missiles and rockets reached my home in Tel Aviv as well. So it's the entire country. As long as we are safe, we should do everything in our power to make sure children in Gaza has some sort of a future, even if they have terrible leadership.
A related question before I turn briefly to domestic issues as well, to wrap it up. We've received a lot of questions, and of course you may have seen there's quite a bit of discussion in the United States these days, and especially this week, around the disparity in vaccination between Israel, which is a world leader in vaccination, and Palestinians in the territories, including in Area C under full Israeli control. A question we receive is quite simple. Would you support Israel making far more effort to vaccinate Palestinians under its rule or Palestinians in the Palestinian Authority? Isn't it Israel's responsibility, given that it controls, to a large degree, the West Bank and Gaza Strip? This is the question we received.
Well, first of all, in terms of responsibility, the Oslo Accords were very clear that every health issue should be arranged and by the Palestinian Authority, not by Israel. It's part of the constituency, it's part of the jurisdiction of the Palestinian Authority to deal with health issues.
But
they are free.
They don't rule Area C at all.
Yeah, I know, but no, I'm talking about the entire PA now. They are free to negotiate a similar or a different deal with Pfizer or Moderna or Sputnik. I'm not sure. I think Sputnik is the name of the Russian vaccine. And we, of course, will not deny them of anything. Having said that, after finishing the vaccination of the people of Israel, I see no reason for Israel not to be helpful in any way it can to vaccinate the Palestinians for two reasons. One is, of course, humanitarian. We don't want innocent people to die. And B, they are so close to us. If we will be vaccinated and they will not, sooner or later, it will kind of flow into Israel. So it's in our best interest, and it's also within our values that people are people, suffering is suffering, and if you can prevent suffering, it's the moral thing to do.
So I'd like to end with a very easy question, and we don't have much time, so it'll be perfect. What's this election about, this fourth election? You probably don't remember. I think it's the fourth. It may be the fifth or the sixth, but I believe it's the fourth. What is this about? It's not about the issues we discussed today, is it?
No, it's about what you've just mentioned. It's about government. It's about the system. I'm running with, no one is going to vote for me or for Netanyahu on this conversation. So I'm not campaigning here. I'm just telling you, I'm running on the slogan that says a sane government, because sanity has become an issue. I don't want to say anything about American politics. I would say only about Israeli politics, but it's a global problem. We have right now, as you said, it's the fourth election within less than 2 years. We have a prime minister with 3 criminal indictments. We have right now all kind of terror supporters moving into the scene. We have a real threat for democracy, and we have this ridiculous 36 ministers government that can do nothing, and therefore, even though we succeeded with the vaccination, there are thousands of people who are dying, not only from COVID-19 but from the mess this government has caused. So this is what it's about. It's about sanity, dignity. We are running a campaign that says the system is broken. Why not? Well, it's time for us to fix it. So even though me and President Biden are very, very, very different people, we are actually saying the same thing to our people.
Leader of the Opposition, Yair Lapid, thank you very much for joining us again. We look forward to hearing from you in the future. And please stay sane. We hope everyone in the campaign stays sane. And I should say, just as a matter of fairness, we look forward also to hosting Prime Minister Netanyahu when schedule permits, so he can also make his argument, of course. Thank you very much again, and have a good evening.
Have a good evening. Thank you.
עושים כאילו את זה שלהם. Okay.
Good morning again, everyone. And we're truly delighted to continue our conversations. And we're delighted to welcome back to the Brookings stage, again, the virtual one, former minister and member of Knesset, Gideon Sa'ar. Good morning, sir.
Hi, how are you there?
We're good, probably a bit colder than you are.
Hope you hadn't decided yet what to vote.
Well,
without hearing me first.
we await eagerly. I should, by way of very short introduction, Gideon Sa'ar is the chair of the New Hope Party in Israel, running explicitly for prime minister in the March 23rd elections, Israel's fourth in 2 years. Sa'ar was a member of Knesset for the Likud party for over a decade and served as education minister and minister of the interior, and of course, member of the security cabinet. He was also previously cabinet secretary, which is actually one of the most powerful positions in Israel. Last year, he ran for the leadership of the Likud, then recently resigned from the Knesset to form a new party, challenging Prime Minister Netanyahu, but from the right wing. Mr. Sa'ar, you've made clear your differences with Netanyahu on issues of his legal issues, especially his ongoing trial. But in terms of foreign policy, a similar question to when I asked Yair Lapid as well. Can you tell us what are the main differences between you and Netanyahu? If you become prime minister sometime in April or May, would Israel take a different direction? Would it be very similar to what it is today?
You can ask me what are my opinion. I don't think that Mr. Netanyahu is the sun and we are the stars that are going around him. I believe that here we have a very serious election campaign. We are in an unbearable situation of going to the fourth election within 2 years. It is unprecedented. And I believe that we must make a big change in our country, and it is connected directly to change the prime minister.
Thank you. So if I may turn into some of the substance of the issues. On Iran in particular, we've discussed already this morning, and we will discuss more throughout this conference. The Biden administration, as expected, has resumed diplomatic contact with Iran, hoping to return to compliance with the JCPOA, both by the United States and by Iran, and aiming afterwards to address wider issues beyond the nuclear one, from ballistic missiles to R&D to activity in other countries in the region. What is your response to this Biden administration move? Do you support it? How do you think Israel should react to this move by the Biden administration?
What kind of move? I'm not sure I get you.
Sorry, what do you think is Israel's appropriate response to the Biden administration's move to resume negotiations with Iran to rejoin the JCPOA, or at least rejoin compliance with the JCPOA?
Well, I believe that right now the Iranians are putting preconditions to the American administration. It is I'm not sure if what is the ultimate goal, and I'm not 100% sure that the ultimate goal is to reach the same agreement of 2015. And if we are talking about a different agreement, then we should know what we're talking about. Because meanwhile, we see until now, the Iranians breaching the JCPOA with regard to nuclear enrichment. And and with other aspects. And I don't think that we are now in the same situation. Even Mr. Netanyahu in the past said about the deal with Iran, fix it or nix it. I conclude that there is a certain agreement when we can find our common objective to stop Iran from getting nuclear capabilities, and we can agree that it is meeting the demands. I believe that today there are two differences. First of all, Trump, regardless to what you might think of all his policies, I think in that respect he was right. He left an asset for the current American administration, and it is the hard sanctions. And I believe that today the hard sanctions is the best leverage that the current administration have towards the Iranians. And I wouldn't do any unilateral concessions because I think that the Iranians are quite worried about their economy regardless their rhetorics. The second thing is that today it's not only Israel, it's the Middle East today is much more united than in the past, also in terms of looking at the dangers of nuclear Iran. I believe this is one of the reasons why the new peace agreements was possible during the previous year. And I think that it is an asset that the United States must preserve and strengthen. And all these dimensions, I think, putting the United States in a very good situation in the possible talks with Iran.
So, assuming the United States under Biden preserves this leverage that you described and does not make any major moves, although they seem to be starting already, are you content that the maximum pressure posture right now by the United States is keeping Iran away from a bomb? There are a lot of reports, including in Israel, that in some ways Iran is closer to the bomb today. Without a new deal, do you think there's urgency? Do you see a heightened danger of Iran going to a bomb? Or should the United States simply be patient and continue maximum pressure without this sense of urgency?
Well, I think that we have more options than the diplomatic option and the economic option. I think that the best thing to do, and I think I will be able to do it if I will be elected by the Israeli people, is to have a very sincere, direct, and effective talks with the new administration in Washington, because basically we have the same objective. We have the same mindset that Iran shouldn't be nuclear. So if we have the same objective, we can share thoughts, how we can reach this objective together. Of course, it is clear that Israel is any other state, and maybe Israel more than other states because it's the most threatened country in the world, has the full right to defend itself by itself, has the full right to prevent enemies around Israel getting nuclear capabilities. We did it in the past with Iraq, we did it in the past with Syria, but I think it is not only an Israeli issue. I think it's a regional issue. I think it's a global issue. I think nuclear Iran will throw the region into a nuclear race. It is something very dangerous. You won't have anything to stop nuclear race in the Middle East if Iran will get nuclear. So I believe both governments should speak directly, effectively, in order to try to reach understandings. If I am 100% sure we will be able to do it, maybe not 100%, but I think we can have good chance to reach to understandings. And for us and for the Americans, in terms of both country national security objectives, it's important to stop the Iranians. They are now violating the agreement publicly in order to create pressure to concessions. But I think they are, I would say, more fragile than what they are perceived to be.
So I wanted to suggest that there are quite a few in Washington and elsewhere who are less sure than you are that America and Israel can find agreement on the Iranian issue. As you know well, under the Obama administration, there was quite a bit of disagreement between the two countries. And given the position of the Biden administration and the current position of the Israeli government, there seems to be at least a fair chance that the countries are going again towards a clash. If that is the case, and if there is no agreement between a government under your leadership and the American administration, what should Israel do? Should the disagreement be public? Should it be private? If the administration does things that Israel genuinely thinks are dangerous for Israel, what would Israel do?
First of all, I said before that I'm not 100% we can reach an agreement, but I think we have a good chance to do so. Israel is a sovereign country, and Israel should act according to its national security concerns. And we have here an issue of a threat, and we cannot, under any circumstances, compromise our security. This is clear.
Including covert or military action despite the United States position?
I said that in the past, we, for example, in 1981, Israel attacked a nuclear installation in Iraq. I think there was a disagreement between the American administration and the Israeli government on the issue, but Israel decided and Israeli acted, and I think that after a few years, America recognized that Israel had done the right thing, mainly when U.S. went to a war in Iraq a few years afterwards. It is in our, as I see it, we should talk with the American administration with a goodwill to find a common ground. But ultimately, we are committed for the security of our country and our citizens.
Thank you. I'd like to turn to another issue, and one on which we've received questions as well from the audience, and that's the question of annexation by Israel of parts of the West Bank. You've long supported annexing and applying Israeli law, civilian law, to parts of the West Bank, and past summer, you did as well. You've also noted recently that you would respect the hiatus of at least a couple of years of not implementing it in the context of the Abraham Accords. But if you become prime minister, I presume you hope to be prime minister for longer than 2 years, and I think we all hope there will not be another election so soon. Before too long, would annexation become on the agenda as well? Would you push to annex parts of the West Bank? And if so, how much? Would you be okay with only the 30% of the Trump administration, or do you hope to annex more?
We spoke about myself. I said time and again, and I hadn't changed my mind, that implementing the Israeli law over our communities in Judea, Samaria, and the Jordan Valley is an Israeli interest, is an Israeli objective. We have almost 500,000 of our citizens living there. We don't demand and we don't see as our objective to implement our law over the Palestinian populated area or over the Palestinian Authority territories. But when we are speaking about our communities in Judea, Samaria, yes, our 500,000 Israelis, they should live under the Israeli law. As I see it, it's an Israeli objective. I hadn't changed my mind on the subject. But there was an understanding, there was a commitment of Netanyahu to the previous administration in Washington in the context of last peace agreements with the Gulf states to suspend the issue of sovereignty for a couple of years. And I said, and I will say it again now, I will fully respect a commitment given by the Israeli government to an American administration.
But I'd just like to push you on this. The couple of years will end in a couple of years. So in 3 or 4 years, would you as prime minister push to annex parts of the West Bank and apply Israeli law as you just described to Jewish settlers there?
As I said, it is an Israeli objective. When I say it's an Israeli objective, it means I am committed to this goal, and I will go forward according to the couple of issues or circumstances that needs consideration at the time, but I didn't hide my view that it is an Israeli interest.
Thank you. So I'd like to turn or follow really on that, on the question of the end game, or your vision for an end game with the Palestinians on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, to the degree that there would be an end to the conflict at all. You've long opposed a two-state solution to this conflict. If you became prime minister, you'd be working with an American administration that is very committed to that vision. What is the alternative vision that you are offering? And assuming, as you just said, that Israeli law would apply to Jews living in the West Bank, would the same apply to Palestinians living there? Would they be granted citizenship or the option of citizenship as Menachem Begin proposed in 76 and 77, or would they be offered less? Could you tell us a little bit about your endgame? How do you see the long-term future with the Palestinians?
Menachem Begin offered an autonomy. I support strong Palestinian autonomy. Today, the vast majority of the Palestinian population in Judea and Samaria are living under Palestinian control and Palestinian regime, as much as the Palestinians in Gaza Strip are living under the Hamas regime. On the ground, you have separation of populations under different regimes. We are not claiming for Israeli sovereignty over Gaza or over Jenin. they don't have the same political status. They have a different political status also according to the agreements between parties. We are, of course, in any minute, we are ready to resume negotiations without preconditions. But we are realistic, and I think that also the current American administration is also realistic about what we can achieve in the foreseeable future. I think in the foreseeable future, we can achieve progress and pragmatic solutions that will improve life of the Palestinians, that will improve certain aspects of our life, from security, economy, environment, tourism, all kinds of things. I'm quite skeptical that we can find or we can have a final status solution within the near future. I think that we must take into consideration the fact that the two-state solution is a paradigm that was tried so many times, even before the establishment of our state. And in 1937, in the Peel Committee, in 1947, in the partition resolution of the UN, afterwards, in the very kind suggestions that Prime Minister Barak and Prime Minister Olmert gave to the Palestinians. And the Palestinians, always in the crucial minutes of decisions, never took a Palestinian state because they didn't want a Palestinian state. They wanted something else. They wanted the destruction of Israel, and they didn't want to put an end to the Israeli conflict, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. I think today we must think about other options. I think that we must speak also with our neighbors, with the Jordanians, with the Egyptians. I think that if we want a viable solution, for example, if someone think about a Palestinian small entity in Judea and Samaria, it won't be viable by itself. It needs some bilateral agreements with us, trilateral agreements with the Jordanian and us, with regard to economy, to tourism, to environment. And I think today we must think about a regional envelope to future arrangements. I'm not sure if we will have Palestinian immediate partners for this kind of solutions today. But as a matter of fact, we don't have Palestinian partners for any kind of solution today. But I think we must think also about other options.
Thank you. One of the questions we've received regards Arab citizens of Israel, inside Israel. And one issue that has received a lot of attention abroad is the nation state, the basic law of the nation state of the Jewish people, that members of your party were very instrumental in drafting and that I know you support. This stressed the national character of Israel, and in the eyes of many downgraded the equality factor that was fundamental to Israeli legal understanding prior. Do you see any room for amending the nation state law, or are people misunderstanding the nation state law? We've already seen courts apply the nation state basic law on issues of equality inside Israel itself.
First of all, I'm fully committed to the equality of the Israeli Arab citizens. It is for us very important. It is for us an issue of our democratic identity. I always believed, I think that with regard to this aspect, today we have an opportunity to better integrate Israeli Arab citizens fully into the Israeli society and economy And I think that today there is also bigger willingness among Israeli Arabs to do so. And this is no doubt one of the, if I will be elected, this will be no doubt one of my objectives to take forward this issue. But to your question, I don't think that nation-state bill is downgrading equality. I think it didn't really hurt any rights of our citizens. But myself and one of my colleagues in my new party, MK Hauser, we put a bill on the table of the Knesset a few months ago. And there we suggested to add the principle of equality to our constitution. We think that we should do it in a different basic law, in the basic law on the dignity of the man and its freedom. We don't think that we should amend the nation-state bill, because if we will amend the nation-state bill, you can interpret the issue as an issue of collective rights to the Arab minority, and not as human rights or their private status in the country of Israel. So we think we can do that by amending a different basic law, but as a strong commitment of our country. To be frank, our Supreme Court in previous verdict decided that equality is something that arises from the dignity of the man, and this is the interpretation that the Supreme Court already gave to the current basic law. But we are ready to put it directly in a most explicit way in our constitution, and this is no doubt a principle which is important for us to maintain our democratic character.
Thank you. We're very short on time, so I will ask one final question, and I'll go to domestic issues if that's okay. In fact, domestic politics. Could you describe to us what a successful coalition might look like the day after? Who would you consider as coalition partners that you might consider? Who would you not? Is there anyone in the political spectrum you would not invite into your coalition? Are we facing a fifth coalition, a fifth election in June or July? Can you tell us a bit about the future?
Oh, well, according to my experience in politics, it is not professional to speak about future coalition 29 days before the election day. And it is also not very wise to describe future coalitions, because usually you are more successful building a coalition when you don't exclude options, but you are coming with more than one option to the table. So I would say it is more wise to wait to convince the public in the next 29 days why a change is needed and why I can make it. I said in the past that I exclude certain extreme parties because of their views, and I will do so, but with these exceptions, I think that there is no need to add to that.
And those exceptions you spoke of were specifically Itamar Ben-Gvir and his faction within the religious Zionism, or also perhaps?
I also spoke about the joint Arab list because, for example, just to explain, MK Kassif, which is MK, he's a Jew, by the way. He's a member of the previous Communist Party, which is one of the parties in the Joint Arab List. He supported the decision of the International Criminal Court in Hague 2 weeks ago. So for me, it is very hard to have a coalition with these views. So I think that basically when you build a coalition, you cannot build it on extremists, and you must find a common ground. But I would say that today, in the current situation in Israel, one should make an effort to have an agreement on issues which are not really in dispute, because during the next years, we will have, after this corona crisis, we will have a huge work to do with our economy, a huge work with our health system and education system. And basically, these are issues with less controversy.
Sir, former Minister Gidon Sal, thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate it. We hope the next 29 days are sufferable and that you are preparing for election number 5. Thank you very much.
I hope that will be avoided. One of the reasons I think it is crucially important to replace the current prime minister is because we went to four rounds of elections, and within 2 years, and I don't think that we will reach stability without replacing the prime minister.
Thank you again very much for your time, sir, and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Oh, it's so helpful if I unmute. Somebody had to do that once in this panel. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. And I want to welcome all of you to our panel on climate and water. I have with me Nada Majdalani. She's with EcoPeace, where she's the director of the Palestine office, and she focuses on connecting climate, energy, and water security. I'd also like to welcome Nadim Farzala. He's at the American University of Beirut, where he's the director of the Climate Change and Environment Program. And like me, he comes from an environmental engineering background. So welcome to both of you. Thank you so much for joining us. Before I get the conversation started, I want to let those in our audience know that you can send in questions. We'll get to as many of them at the end as we can. You can tweet those at the hashtag US Middle East, or you can email them to events@brookings.edu, and we look forward to seeing those come in. But let's get started. Nadim, can you get us started by talking about how energy security and water connect in your region, both physically and how are the regional governments prioritizing this issue? How are they approaching it?
Thanks, Samantha. It's good to be here with you on this panel. Quite an interesting topic to start up with. Energy and water are heavily interlinked, and in ways some people don't realize at times that they are, and especially in our part of the world. the Middle East, North Africa region, or if you want to call it the WANA, the West Asia, North Africa region, depends on how far you want to go in, rely a lot on a combination of groundwater as a dominant source, as well as surface water that is dominating in big basin areas like the Nile, the Euphrates, and the Tigris. For example, energy is needed to pump water from river sources up to reservoirs and then to distribute it. And also energy is needed to pump water from the groundwater and to distribute it. Energy is also needed to desalinate. And a lot of the energy in the Gulf countries goes into desalination. And in many parts of the Gulf countries, they are pumping from depths that for groundwater that are in excess of 2 kilometers. So there's a heavy reliance on energy. On the other side, water can be a source of energy. Hydropower, though it represents less than 2% of energy in the Middle East, is also a source of energy. Also, wastewater is a source of energy in terms of when we treat wastewater, we end up with sludge. This sludge can be digested, and from that digestion, we can get energy. This is the big picture, if you will. How much is this being paid attention to? It depends. The Gulf countries are energy rich. They don't have to worry too much about energy, and they can desalinate as much as they want. Currently in Saudi Arabia, for example, 65% of oil use is for desalination, of domestic oil use is for desal. And by 2025, 10% of revenue in the Gulf countries subsidizes the water sector. So there is that huge interlinkage there. 1.5 million barrels of oil per day are needed to desalinate around 24 million cubic meters of water, more and more. If you move over to the Levant and to the Maghreb countries, you will get now the influx of renewable energy, the use of solar powered pumping, and the use of photovoltaics in huge arrays to power. This is now getting more traction, and governments are more and more getting interested in that, because right now oil is fairly cheap. But a few years ago, it was quite expensive, and that was a very lucrative area to expand into. So this is briefly, I guess, what those linkages. Thank you.
Seems like we're moving somewhat from turning oil into water into turning renewables into water, which is good from a climate perspective as well. It's exciting to see. Nada, can you talk a bit more specifically about energy and water security in the Levant and how they connect in the region you spend most of your time thinking about?
Yes, definitely. I mean, this is definitely a crucial topic for the Middle East and the Levant specifically. When we speak about energy and water security and we link it to climate change, we are often thinking also of the broader security issues. Let us give an example of, for instance, the uprising in Syria, which has started actually because of water shortage and water insecurity, when farmers were not able to basically cultivate, and there was excessive pumping of water resources and the inability to replenish that, and also the fragile system of the government that could not actually support alternatives for these farmers. This has actually led to repercussions on the overall security of the country, and then the repercussions on the region overall. And now we have refugees sitting in Jordan, in Europe, and everywhere around the world, just because of the failure of some systems to recognize that water and energy security are very much intertwined with the regional and global security. When we look at specifically, because our organization, EcoPeace Middle East, works in Jordan, Israel, and Palestine. And when we address these issues, we look at specifically water, access to water for citizens, specifically in Jordan and Palestine. We are in a water scarce region. We are very much dependent on natural water resources, which are very scarce. There's overpumping. Specifically, we are looking at Gaza Strip as one of the examples of the world where there's excessive overpumping and intrusion of seawater, which is also affecting the quality of water. In Jordan, we are looking at the far distance between the water resources and the centers of high population, like Amman and Irbit, whereas the source of water is approximately 300 to 400 kilometers away. When we look at Palestine, this is more complex because water issues are very much also connected to the political conflict and to the inability of the Palestinian Authority to access water resources because of the current arrangements that we are stuck with throughout the past 25 years. And so, therefore, when we look at these, equations with a million something refugees sitting in Jordan, with the deteriorating situation on ground for the Palestinians, when there's, some communities in Palestine, they receive water during the summer months of, once every 3 months. Or even they're obliged to buy it through black market with very, very high prices. This also leading to food insecurity, economic insecurity. It is a recipe for disaster. And when we look at Israel, that is more somehow achieving or on the road of achieving water security with desalination, with the use of treated wastewater. We are looking here at a standalone system that is looking at itself like an island. However, if we look at the entire region, if we are not thinking collectively of the repercussions of water and energy insecurity, then we're not addressing the issue overall of the regional security as a collective issue. And here's why we sometimes, when we think as an organization of ideas outside the box, we thought of something that is called the water energy nexus, where energy from renewables can be produced from Jordan because they have the vast areas where they can put solar panels. In return, Palestine and Israel, they can produce desalinated water from the Mediterranean Sea, and they can create these interlinkages and interdependencies in exchanging these resources, similar to the idea of the agreement of coal and steel, which brought the European Union from the ashes of World War II. So here we are linking water energy interconnections with the overall interest for regional sustainability and stability, and as a matter of climate change adaptation and mitigation.
I want to come back in a moment to the political implications of that, because there are many and they're very interesting. But I'd also like to take a moment and go back to Nadim just to talk about desalination for a minute. We've talked a bit about the stress on surface water and on groundwater in the region. Is desalination the way forward? What are some of the pros and cons of the technology, and how should the region think about that as it thinks about how to approach a changing climate going forward?
Desal is not really the, it's the last resort for me, at least. I think of it as a last resort. It depends where you're from, actually. If you look at the Mediterranean rim countries, Desal is an option that's best kept latest. There are so many resources available that if managed properly, they can push desalination further down the road. But eventually it will, at some point, we will get to have to desalinate. Not all countries. The problem with desalination is you have to build these facilities along the coast or a little bit further inland, and the energy needed for that is quite high. And not all countries have access to that. And you have to develop not only the source of power that's needed, it's the grid, and the connectivity of the grid is important. Jordan has stopped a lot of the renewable energy projects right now to reinforce the grid so that they can take on this additional source of energy and of power. So energy is needed. These facilities, desalination facilities, are on the coast, and the coastal areas, I mean, you can look at the Côte d'Azur and you know, and all those nice places. Do you want to put a desal plant right there? You know, it is aesthetically not pleasing. Financially, you can make maybe a little bit more money by, you know, developing that area somehow. So it is in a high cost real estate. It is this is just being the surface. But then when you start looking at the brine that's produced and what is being returned into the sea, and the Mediterranean is a closed sea to a great extent. It is closed. And the Nile is dammed, and it's going to be further dammed now with the Renaissance, the Grand Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia. So the amount of water reaching the Mediterranean is progressively getting less, plus rain is going to get less with change in climate. So the salinity of the sea, just the Mediterranean, is going to rise because of such activities. This is problematic because it will affect the livelihood of many people living along the coast, fishermen, etc. So it's a chain reaction that's happening. My sense is we need to first focus on managing the resources that we have, reducing, cut down losses, use less water, reuse whatever we use, and then try to, you know, save water from, you know, the wet period to the dry period as much as we can. Surface storage, subsurface storage, whatever we can get to. Desalination would be our last resort, but you know, the Gulf countries are there. They don't have, they don't physically have that water, so they have to do it. The challenge now is to find means of not throwing that brine back into the sea and try to do something that is more constructive or less harmful to the environment with that brine. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that perspective. It's important to note that desalination is definitely not the free lunch solution to all this. And in addition to being very energy intensive, you also have the problem of waste, which I don't hear a lot of people talk about brine, but it is really important because you create a lot of it when you're desalinating all that water. But that said, there are some places where it is a necessary technology. And Nada, I'd like to come back to you to talk about some of the thoughts that your group has put together about the way forward in the Levant and the way that green energy and water provision can work together.
Yes. So as I mentioned, and let me here maybe also recap on the various issues and important issues that Dr. Nadim has put in place. What we are proposing in terms of the water energy nexus for the Levant or for the Middle East is not an alternative to what needs to be done on ground in various areas in terms of reforming the water sector, in providing the appropriate infrastructure, particularly on the Palestinian and Jordanian side. There needs to be a reduction of the losses from the networks, which could reach up to 40 and 50% in some areas. We need to look at more energy efficient ways for producing water. We need to reconsider a lot more reuse for our wastewater, domestic and industrial. But also for the region, there's an additional complexity, which is the natural water resources allocation between Palestinians and Israelis. And this is also another dilemma, which even international community is heavily involved in. When we speak generally about desalination here in the region, the notion pops out that we are actually giving up Palestinian water rights from natural resources. And this is not the case, because this has been disputed over the 25 years and has been put as one of the final status issues for negotiations between Palestinians and Israelis. But in the meantime, because of the political complexity, we cannot afford, as Palestinians or as Jordanians or as the region overall, to accept the status quo. Things need to be worked out in parallel. And when we proposed the water energy nexus as a solution for the region, we did not only think about it for Palestine, Israel, and Jordan, but we also thought about it for the entire Levant. We look extensively and intensively on, for instance, the Jordan River Basin, and also how we can integrate water and energy security in this area involving other countries like Lebanon and Syria. How can we engage the Gulf at the moment, countries in areas that are in the south, also in desalination and solar energy around the Red Sea. We look at Egypt, for instance, also as a partner and an important player when it comes to water and energy security issues to Gaza Strip. So when we think of the Levant overall and an exchange process of water and energy nexus and linking it to climate security and regional security, it is not instead of or jumping beyond the wall of and the political barriers, but we look at them basically as trust building measures, as potential ways forward to move on the more difficult files, which are stuck in terms of the geopolitical arena in our region. And by that, as I mentioned, it comes with also not only geopolitical benefits, but it also comes with financial and economic benefits. Because when we look at solar energy production and export, which can be wheeled to Palestine and Israel, produce desalinated water from clean sources, not from conventional energy sources. This also is an encouraging factor to private sector. So we're not asking the government to take care of these issues, but we're actually asking our government to set out the appropriate regulatory environment, which would enable private sector to actually be the driving force for implementing such a project.
Yes, I think everything that both of you are saying points to the importance of the word "and" in this process. I work on energy systems for the most part, and I'm always saying we need that technology and that technology and that technology. And this is true in water resources as well. There's no silver bullet, only silver buckshot. I have a question from the audience that I think I'll go ahead and send to you, Nada, and that is, how have the Abraham Accords impacted the water landscape in the region? Can you go ahead and take that question?
Until the moment, it really hasn't brought any immediate impact on the water sector. But what I can say is that we're looking eagerly at what is coming next with the new Biden administration towards its foreign policy in the Middle East, particularly now that we're seeing also that with engaging the Gulf countries in the region, with the new vision of the new Biden administration towards climate change issues, with appointing John Kerry as a special climate envoy, And finally, also congratulations on signing again to the Paris Agreement by the US. We're looking at a more maybe now fostering environment potentially towards looking at climate change cooperation and cross-border cooperation, and fostering, first of all, the mediation role, and mobilizing the financial resources, either from the Gulf countries or from the US or even from the European countries, because now we see that potentially with as people working in the sector who have been seeing a lot of a lack of resources and a lot of lack of political will to move forward on some of the aspects that are relevant to resolving some of the transboundary wastewater and water issues, when it comes to also funding for infrastructure projects and large-scale infrastructure projects, and also safeguarding the security of these infrastructure projects and providing also some guarantees on these investments. So we haven't yet seen the direct and immediate impact, but we would like to see down the road potentially maybe more private sector engagement in green businesses in the region, and potentially collaborations on technology transfer and know-how, which would actually put us in a better shape for climate change adaptation and mitigation, and enabling us to basically manage our water resources in a more efficient way.
I'd like to continue in that vein with you, Nadam. Thinking about how you can turn the intersection between water and energy and climate perhaps into a building block for relations within the region and perhaps with the new Biden administration, making that more of a building block for relationships rather than the stumbling block that it's been in the past. Can you talk about things that the Biden administration can do to help further the kind of political will that we need for cooperation on these subjects?
This is the testy question here. Historically, the transboundary relationship in the region has been adversarial in some aspects, and it has not been conducted according to any UN convention on transboundary waters. It was basically sort of governed by military strength. If you look at the Euphrates-Tigris, Turkey has the upper hand because militarily it is stronger than and has been stronger than Iraq and Syria. On the Jordan River, Israel is dominated by militarily, and it's the downstream country, dominated Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and the Palestinians, and took what it wanted. Both countries took what they wanted from the water, and it didn't work out well. It may have worked out better for Israel than the other riparians. If you look at the Grand Renaissance Dam, Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, it has triggered it is more destabilizing than what people anticipated. And there is, I don't know if the internal friction in Ethiopia is due to the GERD or as a diversion of the GERD, and the current tension between Ethiopia and Sudan over the refilling, the second phase of the refilling, but there is also tension there. So the Biden administration has a lot on their hand to diffuse this and to work towards more of working within international norms and agreeing to international norms in dealing with transboundary waters. There are, certain embedded rights that do no harm, the prior utilization of waters, etc. These are all embedded in these conventions and in these international water laws. And this is, I think, would be a very sound basis to start from, rather than using water as an adversarial tool, as bending people's elbows to push countries one way or another. And it's not too difficult to get. I mean, the technology in terms of desalination and is getting better and better. And many countries in the region, as we said before, are using this. So water is no longer an existential threat to many countries, not anymore. But getting to it at a reasonable price, having the water security that is needed for countries or communities to live healthily, to be productive, and to be sustainable in their growth, requires that access to water becomes easier and less of a struggle. Right now, if you look at some countries or some parts of countries, it is a major struggle. If
Nadim,
I may just jump now.
We're losing
the
your
Iraqis
for just a moment.
Always viewed as the breadbasket of the Middle East.
Nadim, we're losing you for a moment. I'm going to move over to Nada to talk about some of these issues. I mean, if you think of an area where scarcity of water has really become an issue, Palestine and Jordan are really important areas, and in the Jordan River Valley. I'd love to hear you continue some of the points that Nadim's making.
Well, yes. If the last thing I quote from Nadim was food security, and indeed, when we look, for example, at the Jordan Valley, that is shared between also Palestinians and Jordanians, they have the same characteristics, and they have the same maybe struggles in terms of access to water. Poverty rates are very high. Unemployment rates are also soaring. We're looking at 40% unemployment between youth, specifically in the West Bank, almost the same percentage in Jordan. We're looking at a reduction of the rates of the contribution of the agricultural sector to our GDP. Looking back in the early 1990s, for instance, in Palestine, the agricultural sector used to contribute around 13% to 14% of the Palestinian GDP. Today, we're only talking about only about 3%. Similarly, is the same percentage in Jordan. It's about 3.5%. Of the contribution of the agricultural sector. So we're definitely looking here at issues that are relevant to instability in food security, but also instability in economic security and job creation. This is a boiling pot basically for the region, especially among the young generation. If I have to look at another hotspot, it would be the Gaza Strip. We're talking about 2 million people who have been sitting under blockade for the past 15 years. The blockade not only includes food, medicine, or construction material, but also some essential material that is necessary for the development of the water sector and sanitation sector and energy sector. Gaza today lives in a status where the underground aquifer is non-suitable for human consumption. A UNICEF report mentioned that Gaza will not be livable by 2020. We're now in 2021. 97% of the water aquifer is damaged. People live under dire conditions. We have like 85% of poverty, high rates of unemployment, and the security instability because of the division between the West Bank and Gaza has also exacerbated the situation. So you can imagine that also the energy insecurity in Gaza has also led to the inability for the water facilities and wastewater facilities to operate in an appropriate way. And here's where we need to recognize the regional interlinkages. When Israel is blocking Gaza all over these years, when water is not supplied sufficiently, when material that is necessary and energy that is necessary for water and sanitation projects are not being efficiently and appropriately mobilized, the repercussions are not only on the Gazan people. The repercussions are not only on the public health of the Gazan people, but it is transboundary. On a daily basis, there's around 100,000 liters of untreated sewage that is traveling north from Gaza towards Israel, polluting beaches, and also causing some of the desalination plants that are huge on the Israeli side to shut down because of the pollution. And this has been brought up to the attention of the Israeli public, and eventually the public could not stand still because of a mobilization effort by civil society organizations like us, who have put responsibility that, okay, the security reasons that Israel is coming through with in terms of the blockade on Gaza, they have repercussions on Israel itself, and it's like shooting themselves in the foot in terms of also impacting the water security of the Israeli citizens themselves. So here's where really water and environmental issues need to be looked at outside the spectrum of militarized security systems. They need to be looked at in terms of collective developmental and mutual interest systems that offer the ability for all parties to be able to have same ability to develop and access water resources and access appropriate services in a manner that they can be working in an integrated manner against the difficulties that we're going to be seeing until the end of the century. I mean, with climate change in this region, we're looking at 30% less precipitation. We're looking at soaring temperatures reaching up to 4 degrees Celsius. We cannot afford doing this on our own, each country by itself. We need to look at the transboundary potentials and possibilities. We need to look at also water issues as a low-hanging fruit that could actually lead to the stabilization of the region rather than a means for division. I think Dr. Nadim is back. I don't want to.
Yes, he is. I'm happy to see him back. Yes, you raise a lot of issues. Water issues never stay within political boundaries. And the other issue I hear you raising is that water, it's not just an economic good, it's also a fundamental human right and makes other things impossible if you don't have access to water. And Nadim, this really raises a question that I got from the audience, I think is a really good one. What does water security in the Middle East and North Africa region mean for global security? How might this further not respect boundaries? And what might it mean for global security?
Yeah. Well, look, the world is a village, right? Somebody said that not too far back. So yeah, look, water security, when you want to think about it, is not the traditional, and this is how we've been approaching it here at the Isam Paris Institute at AUB. This is how we're looking at it. Water security is not about how much water do I have, how many people do I have to give it to. Water security is a whole set of issues. Water security is about that, affording people water, but it is also about the environment from which we take the water and the environment to which we return the water. It's about the infrastructure we use to convey and store that water and treat the wastewater. It is about the productivity of that water. Keep that point in mind. It's about the hazard, floods, droughts, etc., that are associated with it and how countries plan to face up to that. So I just want to touch upon these two. There is the other one, the sixth one is governance and how to deal with that, with the rules, the regulations, the institutional framework, the capacity of the people to run the systems, etc. But if we focus on two issues, hazards such as floods and droughts, and the productivity of the water that we're using. Starting with the hazards, if countries do not plan and implement measures to protect their communities, their society against droughts, and prepare in advance through technology, through forecasting, through tracking weather patterns and shifts, looking at trends, developing all the needed science to be able to track, then we can forecast droughts and prepare against those. And rules should be in place to help that. Storage, use of water, etc. All of these come there. Floods as well. Floods are devastating and quick to happen, and we need to turn those into something that's good, where we can benefit from the excess water that comes in and divert it somewhere where we can store it. These are two quick issues that we can get. And then the productivity of that water is essential so that people can make a decent living, whether in agriculture, whether in industry, etc. What that means to people living in there. If a drought happens and we are ill prepared for it, people will then have, and we've seen that in part. I disagree with Nada a little bit about the Syria issue. The drought did not really cause the war. There were many other aspects, but drought was one of the aspects, and it displaced 150,000 families all of a sudden. Imagine those people now, something happened. Instead of heading southwest, they went northwest, all the way through Turkey to Europe. And Europe suddenly now shut its doors, and you've got refugees from Syria all over the place in Turkey and in Greece. This is an added stress. These people are not necessarily water immigrants. They are climate immigrants. They are environmental immigrants. Droughts do the same thing. Also, when people cannot make enough or live decently from water-driven industries, agriculture or whatever, they tend to pull up roots and then head somewhere else and move. Typically, in our part of the world, there's a huge rural movement, has been for a while, from rural areas to the cities. More than 60% of the Arab world lives in urban areas. This is a big number, and this is growing. And the demands for water, even though they are less than agriculture, but the social services required, the waste generated is much higher. This tends to breed tension, and then tension would spill into conflict. It happens. And this conflict then triggers other conflicts or gets translocated to other countries. So it is imperative that we empower and build the capacity of local communities at all levels to be able to manage their resources within a bigger context, of course. This, I totally agree. We need to build a bigger picture and within that manage our resources so that at the end of the day, people live with dignity and have access to water, clean water in good quantities that enables them to live a healthy and productive life. This is where the crux lies. And then if you then mess with that balance, it's going to have a ripple effect and reach out elsewhere. That's it for now.
I hear you. What I hear you saying implies a really strong need for infrastructure, When we think about this region and climate change, we tend to think about overwhelming heat and droughts, and forget that climate change often entails just more energetic weather in general, including flooding and all of these things. And then the increasing urban nature of the region all cries out for additional infrastructure. Are governments understanding this need, approaching this need with the kind of care that is required? And what can the international community do to help or learn from what's happening in the region? How can we make some of these connections?
Look, the problem with infrastructure is not building it oftentimes, it's with maintaining it. People can't, there's been a lot of money that has been sunk into more or less decent designs. But once you sink in, you put in this capital investment, managing and operating these requires money. And people don't build this into the lifetime of a project and develop the budgets for that. That's one side. Another side is people do not, once they build those infrastructure, wastewater treatment facilities, sophisticated desalination plants, etc., you need the capacity to manage this. And if you don't build it locally, then the total continuous reliance on outsiders becomes problematic. Some countries are working well on that. They're building that, they're designing it properly, and execution is more or less okay. We need to maintain that. The key issue in our infrastructure is, it depends on what parts of the Arab world. Many places lack storage facilities. The Levant is poor in its ability to store water. And if you store on surface storage, dams basically, and reservoirs, with climate change and the increase in terms of temperature, that the evaporative losses are going to be higher and higher. But then what do? Can you store in the subsurface? Probably not, because many of these areas are karstic in nature, and you put water somewhere, it ends up somewhere else, and you can't get it. So there needs to be a confluence of, research that helps improve on the storage, that there needs to be more and more work done on reducing leakages, unaccounted for water, whether that's technical or outright theft. There needs to be help in terms of reducing demand. The reduction in demand is critical. Not very few countries are working on that end. They're starting with increasing supply. That's wrong. We need to address the issue of try to harvest as much as we can of rainfall. And in parts of the Arabian Peninsula, if you look at Yemen and Oman is very well known for fog harvesting. They do a very good job at that. And this is part of something that we can do in the Levant as well. But it's not part of our tradition, because more or less we had enough water for us at that time. So I don't know, the international community can help in doing that, but they have to be responsive to the local agendas rather than to their own political agendas. That there are some donor-driven projects, whereas the countries use donor money to sway politically one group or another, and with not really ultimate benefit to the people that are being targeted. This is something that needs to be worked on to be truly a benevolent donor, rather than a donor with lots of strings attached.
My unmute didn't want to unmute.
Can I add maybe one additional thing?
Please do.
To what Dr. Nadim has mentioned, I think not only the technical capacity is required, but also some of the issues that are also related to the institutional setups that are required. You can get the best technicians and engineers in the world to put the fittings and to put pipes together and maintain the systems, but also maintaining the system means that there is the appropriate institutional capacity to recover the financial costs. and to be able to basically drive revenues and collect fees appropriately that would cover actually the operational costs and maintenance costs. And this is very often in our region a big dilemma, which definitely also the international, the donor community should look at very, as Dr. Nadeem mentioned, look at specifically and with great concern when they design and they pick up technologies that are highly costly and they require a lot of financial appropriate management.
Yes, you both make terrific points. It's from thinking of the donor community, it's very excited to build a new facility and cut a ribbon, but keeping the operations and maintenance going and the funding and the nuts and bolts of trying to balance supply and demand isn't nearly so sexy, frankly, attractive to the donor community, and it often gets overlooked, which is a real shame. I'd like to hear more from you, Nada. I got a question about, it's quite specific, but an interesting one. Could greater investment in batteries to enhance Jordan's ability to store solar energy improve its capacity to pump desalinated water? A bit of a specific question, but an interesting one about the linkage between renewable energy and water supply.
So definitely storage capacity with an improvement in the technology of storing solar would help. But if we are more specific, maybe it depends on what kind of desalination we're talking about or where is it coming from. If we're talking about storage facilities on the Jordanian side for large-scale solar fields, which would store the energy and enables Jordan to basically export energy to Palestine and Israel 24/7 and wheel this energy from Jordan towards and through the West Bank towards Gaza and towards the coastal lines in Tel Aviv, then yes, it is potentially a great idea. However, it is at the moment not cost effective. The technology has not reached yet to a point in terms of the storage capacity to make this possible in terms of cost recovery, and it is not still very attractive for businesses to basically invest in this, and for entrepreneurs to invest in this technology on the larger scale capacity. As we move forward and we see how the technology is improving, potentially yes, but at the moment, with the current basically agreements between at least the Palestinian and Jordanian side in terms of importing electricity from the Jordanian to the Palestinian side, we are looking at a mix of energy and mostly coming from conventional resources. But if we want to make a big leap and jump in terms of Jordan being an exporter of renewables 24/7, we definitely need to look at and see improvement in the storage capacity and technology, but also in the cost effectiveness of this technology.
Yeah, those words 24/7 are really the kicker. They are the most important part. We're starting to run low on time, but I'd like to ask a wrap-up question of both of you, and I'll start with you, Nada, and then we'll go back to Nadeem. And that is, given the new Biden administration is concerned about climate, what is the one piece of advice you'd like to give them on managing the energy-water nexus in the Middle East? What's the one thing that's most important for them to address, or the most important thing that the U.S. can do as it re-engages on these issues?
Yes, that's the $1 million question that we're all waiting for to hear. We, at least as an organization, when we look at our experience over the past 26 years, we have compiled an experience and a set of steps and vision for the region to address climate change issues and water and environmental issues. I think we need to look at 3 steps or 4 steps. The first step is to amplify people's engagement and awareness and across all levels in terms of youth, women, farmers, local community leaders, activists, you name it. When it comes to also some specific areas in our region, we need to look at hotspots such as the Jordan Valley, for instance, and look at what can be done in terms of investments that can be done there in terms of infrastructure, engaging also private sector community in terms of innovation in businesses that are green, that are tackling issues that are relevant to renewables, smart agriculture, technology, etc. The other level would be fostering the exchange of water and energy between the countries. And the fourth would be, and the most important, would be prioritizing the reallocation of natural water resources so that the Palestinians can get also their fair share of natural water resources from the aquifers and from the River Jordan. These are the 4 steps which EcoPeace Middle East has put together in a concept or a report called the Green Blue Deal for the Middle East. And this is where we are trying to engage international community on the various technical but also political levels and diplomatic levels to engage or to foster discussions, at least on the higher level among our governments, to look at climate change issues within these 4 steps, but also to put the necessary investments. And we look at the Biden administration and its new vision and interest in climate change issues, and its new entry to the Middle East peace process as a key player. We look at a lot of attention from the Biden administration at the diplomatic level, at the mediation level, but also at the infrastructure development level. So there's a lot to do. And as Dr. Nadeem mentioned, all over the world, we're expecting that the new administration has something to give and to contribute.
There are certainly high expectations all over the world on this and many issues. Dr. Nadeem.
Yeah. Oh, look, we have in terms. I'm going to take a bigger picture look at this. The Middle Eastern countries have acceded to the Paris Agreement, but there are a lot of trepidations amongst the oil-producing countries about the push towards decarbonizing our economies, and this is leading some countries like Saudi Arabia and others to resist this it's not rapid, it's snail pace. It's really terrible how fast we're moving towards achieving the Paris Agreement's goals. I mean, we're not even doing half enough or quarter enough yet. But the Biden administration can work with its traditional ally, the Saudis, in allaying their fears and in helping them transitioning and diversifying their economy into something that is less reliant on total oil production for fossil fuel. And there are other uses for petroleum products that can be integrated using modern technologies that would enable less polluting countries. This will then lead to less pressure by the Saudis and the Gulf countries on non-oil producing countries in the negotiations in the Paris, in the climate change negotiations, because right now oil producing countries are dictating the pace for negotiations, and this is coming at the expense of the Levant countries, which are not oil producing, and we have differing issues, but because most of our countries here are reliant on Saudi support, financial support, and Emirati financial support, and Qatari financial support, so many countries toe the line, and that costs them. So the Biden administration, through Secretary Kerry, fantastic choice, brings foreign secretary experience with a huge, fantastic drive for the environment. This brings together. This can help allay fears and support the smaller non-oil producing countries in their endeavor to go towards more renewable energy, to support renewable energy development, and then to support the greener development of these countries. This is the big push that can happen. This is a big ask. This is a very big ask. But we cannot afford not to address the decarbonization and help countries that rely on fossil fuel for their existence, basically, to scale back and find alternative sources and support this alternative sources rather than mine it and dig deep into that. This is what I would like personally from the Biden administration.
Yes, it's I hope someone is listening. That it's a difficult ask, but it's definitely at the crux of the issue. I'd like to say thanks so much to both of you for sharing your time and your expertise with me and with everyone watching. And with that, I'll close the session. But thank you to all of you who are watching as well.
Thank you for having us here.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us again. And my name is Tamara Kaufman-Wittes. I'm a senior fellow in the Center for Middle East Policy, and really delighted to have joining me for the next portion of our program, my friend and colleague, Salam Fayyad. Salam is, of course, a distinguished fellow here in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings. And of course, he was the Prime Minister of the Palestinian Authority from 2007 to 2013. We are very fortunate to have Salam's expertise and experience with us today as we revisit some of the themes that we heard not only in the last panel on energy and water, but throughout our morning about how the Biden administration is going to pursue policies in the Middle East, specifically related to Palestine and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So Salam, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Ivana. Thank you for the kind invitation and introduction. Appreciate it.
So the Biden administration is coming in at a really transformative moment in global politics, in the Middle East, and also here in the United States. And we heard about that a little bit this morning from Megan O'Sullivan and Will Hurd and our own Suzanne Maloney. When it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict specifically, we're dealing not only with what's left behind by the Trump administration, its torpedoing of the relationship with the Palestinians, and its radical departure from decades of previous American policy in mediating the conflict. But we're also dealing with the fact that even before Donald Trump took office, the peace process as we knew it had reached a dead end. And so the Biden administration has before it the task not only of repairing from the last 4 years, but of building something new if it wants to engage on that conflict. Now, we heard from several of our American policy analysts this morning that this conflict is nowhere near resolution, and maybe it shouldn't be a major priority for the Biden administration at all. So, Salam, let me start by saying, if you had 5 minutes with President Biden right now, what would you tell him about where this conflict should rank in his understanding of the Middle East, and what should be his #1 priority in addressing it?
Well, once again, Tamara, thank you very much. Before you begin to time me in terms of my conversation with, if I had 5 minutes with President Biden, let me first say that I agree with a very fundamental point you have made in the introduction about the so-called peace process having gotten to a dead end before Donald J. Trump showed up, because many people, given the many transgressions, and I will talk about those actually, that took place under the previous administration, would start a conversation by making it sound as if things were all okay, but for the Trump presidency. Things were not, and I agree with that very fundamental point you made. And so if you wish to begin to time me now, fine. So I say, in connection precisely with what your own introduction about the peace process having gotten to a dead end, what is really needed, in my view, is not only restoration of norms, which is a word or a phrase that's often used in talking about our issue in relation to what has happened over the past 4 or 5 years. What is really required, given what you have said, is a reset, as a matter of fact. If that consideration has not started, it should. But while consideration of what should go into a reset goes on, I think it's important to talk about restoration of norms as part of a broader consideration of restoration insofar as U.S. foreign policy norms around the world generally, in the Middle East, in particular, our own issue more specifically. So with that in mind, I'll begin with some general remarks about areas that require immediate attention insofar as the limited objective of restoration. I say limited relative to the broader objective that I identified, namely reset. Beginning actually with the early days of the Trump administration, when he famously said, to the laughter of many in the room at the time, when he was asked about two-state solution, because up until that point in time, he had said nothing about it. And the GOP platform going into that election had omitted reference to two-state solution. It was a good question to ask. And to that, he quipped famously, one state, two states, however many, whatever the parties can agree to. Again, there was laughter in the room. I did not think it was funny myself. I thought it meant something. And we didn't have to wait too long before it became very clear that actually what we were looking at was the complete undoing of the process to the detriment of our national cause and aspirations as we define them. So beginning with that moment in time, that's very important. So when you talk about restoration, the most important thing that needs to be done, and it has been, at least in part done, is to reaffirm U.S. commitment to the concept of two-state solution. That was done even before the November elections took place, last November election, during the campaign and subsequently by President Joe Biden, as well as senior U.S. officials, including Secretary of State Blinken. That's a good start, but given all else that has happened to the process, I think a lot more than a restatement of position, however important that is definitely required. And I'll be very, very specific as I go quickly down the list of the transgressions that I refer to. So moving forward, beyond that session that I talked about early on, to December 2017, the famous policy statement made by then President Donald Trump about the status of Jerusalem, without really getting into details, which included recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, actually capital of the Jewish people in the way that was said many times, and also subsequent moving of the embassy, U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. That was one. There are some issues I can talk about there, but again, moving forward, a year later, little over a year later, in January 2018, subsequent to that, we have several issues that really actually took place. Maybe I should really talk about Jerusalem first and try to relate it to what I started with about the need to do more.
Well, Salam, I think we can do a catalog of Trump's errors, if you will. Yeah. But I think the challenge for Biden is not whether to accept or reject those things, but which step comes first. Yeah. Is it necessary to focus on renewing a diplomatic mission and reopening the PLO mission here in Washington? Is the most urgent thing the humanitarian situation and the restarting of U.S. assistance? Or should he be focused on a new set of negotiations? There are only so many hours in the day. So even if you recognize the urgency of the challenge, you still have to figure out where you're going to put your emphasis.
Understood. I was going to do precisely that in reference to what I said about two things. First, Jerusalem, and then how to relate it to the task of actually restoring confidence in what the pursuit or commitment to two-state solution concept should mean. As a matter of fact, given all else that happened long before Donald Trump showed up, as a matter of fact, and while he was president. So on Jerusalem, let me really, for example, mention something that could concretely actually give some meaning to what restoration could mean in connection with one particular important transgression related to Jerusalem. It was not an issue during the campaign here in the United States. It did not become an issue until recently, Palestinian elections. One of the issues talked about in connection with the status of Jerusalem is whether or not Israel, in keeping with tradition, was going to allow for elections to take place in East Jerusalem as they did back in 1996 for elections for presidency and legislature, and then subsequently in 2005, presidential elections, in 2006 for legislative elections. I guess that makes for a tradition. So it's very important to ensure that that tradition is maintained. Now, Donald Trump did not really say anything about holding of elections in East Jerusalem, Palestinian elections. This has just happened. So one way in which people could really begin to believe that there is seriousness about commitment to two-state solution would be to ensure that should Palestinian elections actually move forward, and that remains to be seen, but should they move forward, that Palestinians living in East Jerusalem are allowed to participate in the elections process fully. So that's one way. Another also related to the status of Jerusalem, not to the point of really forgetting about everything else, because in connection with Jerusalem, something that was said about it by President Trump, former President Trump, was Jerusalem has been taken off the table. That's very important. Again, the objective here is to restore confidence, because there is very little confidence, either in Palestine or Israel, in the continued viability of two-state solution. And that relates to what I said earlier about the need for a reset. So it's very important not to give in to that. So I wouldn't really give an inch on that. Either we're restoring or we're not restoring. I'm not really at all for this business of, well, let's just really forget about one aspect of this. We need for there to be restoration of credibility, faith in the process, because if there is no such thing, then I don't see how we really can move forward too far. So on Jerusalem, for example, among other things, I see no reason why the United States should not, as a matter of urgency, reopen its consulate in Jerusalem. That is very much related to the question of Jerusalem remaining open and to actually bring it back to the table. That's an important, the most effective way in which everybody can be told, and I think should be convinced, that there is seriousness to what's being talked about restoration. That's immensely important. So here I give you just one example about Jerusalem in two senses, ways in which the administration can act to give meaning to the notion that we are really actually restoring norms of foreign policy and so far as the question of Palestine is concerned. Again, there are many issues, as you said, but here is one coming up should elections move forward. Will Israel allow elections to take place in Israel or not? And what would be the US position on that? I mean, this does not really have to be a matter of public diplomacy, but I think some activity on that could begin to send signals that the current administration does not take it as a given that Jerusalem has been taken off the table. Moving forward, actually, there are a lot of issues that culminated in the rolling out of the famously known as the deal of the century in January of last year. That's an important reason why I say it really is not enough to say there is commitment to two-state solution, because the most recent tradition of what that means was that very plan that was put on the table, was rolled out on January 20th last year. And we know what that is about. It was described as a two-state solution, but is it, from our point of view? Does it really measure up to what we might minimally find acceptable at some point in time? I watched some of the conversations that took place earlier today, and as a matter of fact, I don't know if one can really draw much assurance from the references of how Palestinian aspirations might be dealt with in the broader regional context, dignity, living conditions, and what have you. We really have to take a step or two back in the direction of recognizing our national rights as a people. Israel needs to really contend with this very important imperative. Minus that, we'll go on for another more than quarter of a century, as has happened since Oslo, and we'll end up where we are. This really begins to go to the heart of what really should go into the process of getting to a reset. There are some other issues that can really quickly be dealt with. Quickly, as you said, I mean, just to prioritize, again, related to how much confident we can be in statements about commitment to the two-state solution concept on the part of the current administration. Issues related, for example, to the proclamation by the US State Department and the previous administration regarding to the quote-unquote finding of non-illegality of the settlements in the West Bank. That's something that was done, and it can be undone, and it should be undone. Another related issue was most recently was done after the elections in November of last year, which was the labeling of Israeli products made in illegal Israeli settlements in the West Bank. That's something that was done by the previous administration through a policy statement issued by State Department. I see no reason why something like this cannot be reversed. Again, that's important in and of itself, but it's important in beginning to impart confidence and credibility to the assertion that there is a commitment to two-state solution. We can talk about other issues, reopening of our mission in Washington, D.C., and also UNRWA, aid to EPA, and other issues. There's a lot to really go through.
There is.
Most fundamentally, the important issue is how much can we really buy into renewed commitment to two-state solution concept. And when I say we, I don't mean only we Palestinians, the region generally, including those in Israel who still support two-state solution concept.
Thank you, Salam. So what I hear you saying is that credibility in two ways, and they're tied together. The credibility of the United States as a mediator is tied to the credibility of the two-state solution as a potential outcome. And that what you're suggesting is that the United States has a significant role to play in helping Israelis and Palestinians and the region regain their lost faith in a two-state solution. Okay, I would certainly agree that there's a role for the United States to play there, but it does seem like an awfully heavy burden to carry when Israelis and Palestinians themselves have lost so much faith in that outcome. So just earlier today at this conference, we heard from Gidon Sa'ar and Yair Lapid, two Israeli politicians who are aspiring to replace the sitting prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. They have very different visions between the two of them for the relationship between Israel and the Palestinians, both now and in the future. Lapid said, he is concerned about not only for humanitarian reasons, but also for Israelis' own security. He is concerned about the dire situation in Gaza. He wants the Palestinians to have a strong authoritative leadership so that they can negotiate with Israel. Sa'ar, on the other hand, said he is looking to annex parts of the West Bank and supports what he called strong Palestinian autonomy. So I guess the question is, from a Palestinian perspective, even were the United States to push forward on all the fronts that you described to restore the credibility of the two-state solution, how do you cultivate Palestinian faith in that outcome, given that that is what you're looking at on the other side?
Let me, if I may, go back to the point I made at the outset, which is what I'm looking for, as a matter of fact, and for all the reasons that you mentioned, and I agree with them. What I'm looking for is a fundamental reset, given the failure of, or failures over the past more than quarter century. But that's a tall order. I mean, if it has not really been thought through already, while that is happening, what I'm really saying is it's very important to really actually narrow the credibility gap or deficit, if you will, between policy pronouncements, which actually were made during the most recent US presidential campaign, and actual statements made afterwards. I think credibility is a very important word here. And so while that is being thought through, why not really begin by reversing and acting to reverse, in fact, all of those transgressions? If in fact they're not acceptable, why not really do that? That begins to really impart some credibility, because that's not the end game. You are absolutely right. What should go into the reset is the more important question. I didn't think that, as a matter of fact, there is at this moment readiness to really contemplate that in a thorough enough way to where in short order one can expect a plan going forward as to how to really get there. So while that is being done and discussed through quiet channels, diplomacy, checking it out here and there to come up with some ideas, there are some very important things, including living conditions. I'm not really putting those aside because they're absolutely important. And they're very germane to what I believe we as Palestinians should be most doggedly pursuing at all times, which is to enhance the capacity of our people to persevere and withstand the adversity of the occupation on the way to ending it. So there is an important agenda, but I think it's absolutely important. I would not really want to give an easy pass on actions relative to pronouncements and commitments made, both during campaign and subsequently. It is in the paramount interest, US interest, to actually begin to restore that confidence and for words to really begin to mean something, because the heavy lifting is going to come later. And if the US administration does not make good on what it has signaled about its intention to reverse the transgressions, then I think it will be a taller order to really begin to buy into a new paradigm. What are we looking at here? If that's what you really want to engage me, and I'm prepared to really do that, but that's fine. Actually, it's quite clear to me. I watched one of the interventions that you referred to, so I really cannot comment on the earlier one by Mr. Lapid. But it's very clear to me, actually, without even the benefit of having listened in, that where the center of gravity of Israeli body politic today, and possibly even the likely outcome of the fourth election in over a short period of time, I don't know. Elections are elections. That's 29 days down the road. I don't know what the outcome is going to be. But if it's anything like where the Israeli government has been over the previous rounds of elections, that's what I define as center of gravity of body politic in Israel. I just don't see anything said about a Palestinian state that could begin to make any sense to any Palestinian. I heard Mr. Saar talking about, and maybe Mr. Lapid, I don't know, but Mr. Saab saying about Palestinian partner. I mean, there can be no Palestinian partner in a conversation on a process, the outcome of which, the ultimate outcome of which, is something along the lines of what he was really talking about. I do not wish to personalize this, but generally speaking, that's why I talk about the center of gravity of body politic in Israel. I mean, is the government of Israel, that's the most fundamental question that we really need to get an answer to. Does it really mean it when it says two-state solution? Let me remind you and the audience, that plan, the deal of the century, quote unquote, that was rolled out January of last year, it was described as a two-state solution to the conflict in many ways. I mean, obviously, it was not something that any Palestinian would be willing to consider even looking at in a serious way, given all the flaws in it. And I personally wrote extensively about that. But actually, not many people actually noticed this. While Mr. Netanyahu welcomed it and many in Israel said, great, 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 but I have not really heard the magic word, we accept it. Not even that midget of a plan, not even that which promised nothing more than a Mickey Mouse, quote unquote, state, won the approval, formal acceptance of the Israeli government. That's the kind of difficulty that we Palestinians are looking at, and it's real. So that's why I really keep saying it's not enough. Maybe it was at the time Oslo Accords were drawn up and concluded and agreed to, much to the pleasure, satisfaction of many who really wanted to really see peace come to the region, stability, peace with stability and justice for all. But at the same time, this is reality. So we do not want to really get into a process where from now we are told, or you're looking at some kind of regional solution, little bit of tourism and cooperation and health issues, important. I'm not really saying, I mean, that's really my own background. I'm really interested in all of this. And I think all of this is important. But if that is the ceiling vis-a-vis our own aspirations, that's a non-starter. So I know that that's really an argument for no solution, to be honest with you, not for two-state solution or one-state solution. That's an argument for no solution. And on this, you may be surprised to hear this from me. There is a partner, because we Palestinians, I for one, do not see a solution. So why don't we right now, and not over a short period of time anyway? So why don't we really begin this process of really looking for that reset button by accepting it as a given, just as you sort of intimated, that there is no solution of any kind that is likely to be accepted, an offer that can be accepted by Palestinians. To be honest with you, there is no solution likely anytime soon. Given that, what can be done? There is a lot of restoration that really needs to happen, not only insofar as what U.S. policy has to do, as a matter of fact, relative to its own commitments and stated policy. There's a lot of restoration that really needs to take place on our side, we Palestinians, and that really takes a lot of work. I can really make the reference to elections. That's just a link in a long chain of things that really need to happen before we really get to the point of really serious restoration. And to be honest with you, I would have much preferred for there to be serious effort made toward establishing Palestinian unity than elections, rather than really begin with elections and seek to unify or look at elections as a means to unify. As a matter of fact, in the way they're talked about elections or originally conceived, if anything, they were likely to lead to nothing but perpetuating status quo, where Gaza is Gaza and West Bank is West Bank. And somebody really needs to tell me, how can we really possibly be seriously talking about a Palestinian state with that state of separation continuing? So what I'm really saying, that's a part of this whole restoration that really needs to take place. We do need a political framework, but don't get me wrong. We cannot really be operating in isolation. So we need a political framework. What could that be? From our point of view, I'm here to tell you what our point of view, and I'm prepared to listen to reaction on what the Israeli side has to say about this. From our point of view, and I think a fair-minded examination of the progression of events, the regression, as a matter of fact, since the signing of Oslo Accords up until now, there is nothing but a race to the bottom, to be honest with you, from our point of view. What appeared to be certainly right to presume even earlier, back in 1988, which is we kind of signal our willingness to accept a state on 22% of our ancestral land as a solution. What started as a promise of that, well, it ended up in the most recent version of it as the deal of century, and I don't really need to talk more about that. So clearly, what we really need to do here is understand that a new political framework cannot be just a continuation of what happened. Let's just really rush back into negotiations. That's a recipe for yet another round of failure. It's certain failure. And maybe actually it could lead to destabilization, if you ask me. So that's one thing that I would list under the don'ts. Don't rush back into an effort that really is projected as something like previous rounds of negotiations. If only we really could convince the parties to postpone this issue, that issue, maybe we can get agreement on that issue. So that's just not going to work. Part of my own diagnosis, and I think this is generally true on the Palestinian side, is that we see the main flow of the process that actually was formalized in Oslo in 1993 as something that really actually started without recognition of any of our fundamental rights as a people. And so anything that's given our way, in the words of essentially said or unsaid, President Trump and others, I mean, what do the Palestinians have to complain about? They didn't have a state before, we're giving them one. And that's really how it has really been cast. Well, if that had worked quickly after Oslo, fine, but it didn't, and it's not likely to work anymore. Actually, I don't see it working at all, ever, to be honest with you.
Okay, so you've just...
Let me conclude on this point, and very specifically. What we need before launching of yet another round of negotiations that can promise nothing but failure is a statement of our recognition, a statement of recognition of our national rights as a people. And let me very clearly state what those are. First, let's begin with a simple question and address it to the Israeli government. Do they recognize us as a people or not? Are we an invented people, as somebody famously said in another US presidential election, or are we a people, just like any other people around the world? Are we not entitled to the exercise of our right to self-determination, just like all peoples around the world? Are we not entitled under that heading to live as free people with dignity in a country of our own? I'm not talking about the contours of that state, of that entity. I'm talking about recognition of our right to it. That's fundamentally important. There are other aspects of international law that pertain to our cause, including the issue of return. That's a part of international law as well, and that cannot be dismissed. Our right of return has to be recognized. It's part of our national rights. We begin with a statement of recognition of rights, and then work gradually towards something that could be agreed not anytime soon. I don't see it happening, but that is the framework within which the very important restoration work that's necessary on our side can take place, where Palestinian polity can be united. And in connection with that, let me just make one quick point.
I'm gonna stop you there because
okay. All right.
I want to first pick up on this point about recognition of rights. And when you think back to the achievements and the failures of the Oslo process, the one achievement that has not been dismantled or overridden is the mutual recognition between Israel and the PLO. And at the time, American policymakers, Dennis Ross wrote about this in his memoir, American policymakers understood that Israel's recognizing the PLO meant Israel recognizes that Palestinians expect and demand statehood, and that they are agreeing to reckon with that in the negotiations. Now, clearly, as you're describing, that assumption has been eroded over time. And so, I think you're proposing as a political framework something that would be much more concrete than the mutual recognition of Oslo ever was. But I want to come back to what you said about Palestinian unity. Because in 1993, one could recognize the PLO as the authoritative representative voice of the Palestinian people. And today, that is a much more contentious issue. Who represents the Palestinians? So you made the argument that you would have preferred to see a focus on Palestinian political unity first and elections second. But at least as we understand it today, that's not where we are. And elections are planned for later this spring, both for the legislative body and for the presidency. Do you think that it is valuable for the purpose of having a unified, agreed upon set of principles? Is it valuable for Palestinians running in those elections and the parties and movements that are going to run in those elections to agree to a set of common principles, like, for example, the Quartet principles: reject violence, recognize Israel, and respect previous agreements? Isn't that an important baseline for producing an authoritative, unified Palestinian leadership?
Let me say the following, and the point that we have just made actually is very much related to what I was about to say before you raised this question. Is very important. We agree that Palestinian unity is absolutely important. I mean, that, from my point of view, before anything else, that's what we really need to begin with. You cannot really meaningfully address even, living conditions, humanitarian conditions, especially in Gaza, in a sustainable way. And I know this was really looked at extensively, including by Brookings, the serious effort that was made, without really looking into issues of sustainability of that kind of intervention. And there can be no sustainability to intervention on humanitarian issues unless you really have a governing framework that itself is sustainable. In addition, I just really don't see it possible for us to really get from where we are to that desired objective of unity without really, as a matter of fact, addressing the fundamental issues that really have stood in the way of that unity and to some extent contributed actually to the fracture and to the rupture. If you allow me just to really go back to what you said about the question of recognition, and then I'll come back to this point. Absolutely true. I mean, and by the way, in the way that you described it, the so-called Declaration of Mutual Recognition, and you'll understand why I say so-called, it was not, to be honest with you, early on, my own sense, by the way, at the time, I was not really part of the Palestinian Authority. Remember, I was just like reading and etc. At the time, I don't think the significance of the language of that declaration was fully assimilated and understood, to be honest with you, either from our point of view or from Israel's point of view. And much of the debate subsequently that followed about Israel wanting to refine that in the direction of having Palestinians to recognize Israel as a Jewish state, in my view, reflects the extent to which they really did not assimilate the extent of how profound that statement of recognition was on the part of Palestinians. If you ask a layperson what happened in 1993, they'll tell you, oh, Palestinians recognized Israel, or Palestinians recognized Israel's existence. Read, it's one sentence. The PLO, acting on behalf of all Palestinians, and I'll get back to this, acting on all Palestinians, recognized the right of the state of Israel to exist in peace and security. That's profound. That's profound. And Israel existed where? And to this day exists where? It exists in that very land, which we Palestinians regard as our ancestral land in our narrative. We can get into that. So here we are. The PLO acting on behalf of all Palestinians recognized the right of Israel to exist there. And what did we get in return? That's why there's just so much symmetry lacking in this formulation. The government of Israel, in response, reacted by saying, government of Israel recognizes the PLO as the representative of Palestinian people. And if you really think about that, that's a self-serving recognition. It's important for the government of Israel to recognize that body which has just recognized its right to exist by all Palestinians. Now, as I said before, realistically speaking, you're absolutely right, even going back to 88 and maybe even before the 70s, the presumption was that a state was going to follow no later than May 1999. It didn't happen. I'm not here to judge history, but I'm here for us to all be informed by the need for us to really be realistic. That recognition, maybe at the time was understandable, was adequate, it promised a solution that could bring peace and security to the region and the conflict. Because it didn't, ever since then, I mean, the prospects of that materializing continue to recede. So to really go back and really say this is really enough and I'm calling for something more profound, yes, I am. I am, because that's structurally flawed. And my starting point of analysis is parity. I understand the differing narratives, but I should not, and I would not, nor should any Palestinian accept for their narrative to be subordinated to the Jewish narrative. Just as I accept that the Israelis would not accept our assertion to our narrative to supersede theirs.
Understood.
But that's the point. So
Yeah.
I think what I'm really talking about here is a clear statement of recognition of our rights as a people. Because if you really look at it, look through the lens, a Palestinian lens, talk about two-state solution and all that really lost total credibility. There's just no constituency for it anymore. Not because people really reject the idea, but because they really don't see how it can happen. And the first thing they question, and rightly so, is the adequacy of the framework that is supposed to give rise to that. So why don't we really begin with something like that? That is the overall framework. And recognition of rights is important. So if I make a statement that what we want is recognition of rights, I'm not really saying we should not negotiate. That's another matter. But negotiation should not be about rights, should not be about principles. There should be about assurances, there should be about arrangements, and that's where the role of international community, led by the United States, can come in play. But we do need the framework, something like this. Now, about unity. Another problem associated with that recognition is exactly as you rightly pointed out. Recognition was made at the time by the PLO, at the time acting on behalf of all Palestinians. There was objection, surely. There was very little objection to the 1988 transformation, if you will. And the 5-year period between 88 and 93 was unprecedented in the history of the Palestinian national movement, virtually complete consensus. But then came Oslo, and that's when the rift began. Nevertheless, it was understood at the time that the PLO carried enough weight and power for it to really actually be seen as legitimately representing all Palestinians. The truth of the matter, that is no longer the case. That's another thing. That's another reason why this whole thing should be reconfigured on the basis of a reconfigured Palestine Liberation Organization. Reconfigured to include all points of view. No one should be excluded. And to be very precise and direct in answering your question about expectation that candidates and participants in government should conform to principles like the Quartet principles and the like. I think experience tells us, if we agree that unity is a good thing, I'm here to tell you, unity on the basis of exclusion, these things don't go together. If you say, you either have to become like me before we can work together, well, that's a sure recipe for not achieving unity at any point in time. The question, how do you do it? Do we ditch the PLO, this program as it stood and as it continues to stand today in favor of competing Palestinian visions? The answer is no. But should we really continue to insist on everybody who's outside the PLO conforming to those principles? Should we continue to insist on a condition for entry? The answer is equally no. I think there is room for everybody. This, we're like everyone else. We are like other people. I thought pluralism was a good thing until it really got to us Palestinians. As a hallmark of calls for democratization, the virtues of pluralism are constantly really talked about and all of that, except when it comes to us. All of a sudden, we all Palestinians have to look alike, talk alike, have the same beliefs, same background, same everything before we really could talk to the world. That's just not the way to achieve unity. There is a framework, a specific concrete plan that I myself have articulated. And on the Palestinian side, I'm not aware of any side that has said no to it, for sure, that actually attempts to get this balance right by including everybody. Expand it, include all points of view, and have the PLO acting on the basis of its existing program without ditching it, by consensus of all around the table, acting on behalf of all Palestinians, with matters that pertain to our high national interest being decided around that table that includes everybody. Because that's only when the claim to representation is valid. If there are some within the PLO itself, the question is not Hamas and Jihad only. The question are others who are within the PLO who no longer subscribe to the PLO's program. The question relates to the 1 million new voters who, if elections take place in May, would be voting for the first time in their lives. Vast majority of whom don't know and don't care about this at all, if you know what I mean. So clearly we need a serious act of restoration. And the starting point in this conversation cannot be, you cannot join unless you really look like me. The issue is, how do you manage this pluralism? The challenge for democracy is to find good ways to manage it effectively. And there are some concrete ideas. I don't know if there is time for me to really actually express them, that they are in writing available for those who are interested, that actually demonstrate how that balance can be attained in a manner that really maintains our links to the international community, that which the PLO has accomplished. And we shouldn't ditch it. We shouldn't throw the baby with the bathwater, but at the same time, broaden it so everybody is included. In that kind of pluralism, there is strength. And in that kind of pluralism, that's the first logical point for leadership, Palestinian leadership, to be completely legitimate, to embrace, because minus that, we cannot not only deal on issues that pertain to our high national interests and political aspirations, but we cannot in a meaningful way begin to deal with the needs of our people every day, who are really going through a great deal of difficulty. Not only in Gaza, but everywhere. So there are some concrete ideas. I hope that they can be considered as a starting point. So it goes without saying, just to close the conversation on this from my point, I'm not accepting of the notion that candidates or occupants of office in the PA should all swear allegiance to the quartet principles. When I see the government of Israel asked and expected to accept our right to a fully sovereign state on the territory Israel seized in 1967 in its entirety, including East Jerusalem, which to me is the conceptual equivalent of the so-called quartet principles on the Palestinian side, then we'll have this conversation again. When that happens, come talk to me about maybe we should find.
All right. I would point out though, Salam, that I think, we are seeing today with respect to the United States, what happens when you have a new elected political leadership that throws out previous commitments by previously elected leaderships, which is what the Trump administration did, without respect for that norm that you maintain the commitments made by the previous leadership. Now we have a new administration coming in, and a lot of international interlocutors are saying, well, how can we trust your commitments? Because look at what your predecessor did. In other words, that norm of committing to uphold previous agreements is actually quite fundamental for international negotiations and international agreements. And so I hear what you're saying about demanding too much as a price for entry. But I still think that there is a challenge for those who want to negotiate with the Palestinians to understand that if we get an agreement on X and Y, it will be maintained in the future no matter who's elected. That does seem to me a fundamental basis. Let me turn to another international agreement, though, which is now really, some would argue, it's really reshaping not just the region, but the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Personally, I find myself a little more skeptical about the impact, but I want to hear from you. And that is the agreement between Israel and UAE, Israel, Bahrain, Israel, Morocco, maybe Israel, Sudan in the future to normalize diplomatic relations. Now, as you know, this is an overturning of the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002, whereby the Arab states, the members of the Arab League, agreed that they would normalize relations with Israel only in the wake of an Israeli-Palestinian final agreement. So now that leverage, which was handed by the Arab League to the Palestinian leadership, has essentially been taken away. the PA leadership and PLO leadership was very critical of these diplomatic openings. And I want to ask you, number one, how do you think the Palestinian national movement should orient itself toward this development? But number two, is there a way that these diplomatic openings can be used to the benefit of Palestinians in resolving their dispute with Israel?
By the way, that's intimately related to my view of what should happen as part of that restoration that I was really talking about, and I will address that happily. But not before, very quickly say something about upholding commitments. And you're absolutely right. What you said in reference to the previous administration, how important it is. Nobody can disagree with that as a fundamental premise in international relations, and I fully agree. But when was it last that somebody checked with Israel about its honoring its end of the bargain on just about anything? We're kind of really led to a point where we either accept the leftovers, the crumbs that are thrown at us, or otherwise be called, people who just really never miss an opportunity to miss one. I just don't see a real opportunity anywhere. So what you really say is right, and I meant it when I said, had there been an agreement on the basis of the original outline that was envisioned in Oslo, we would not be having this conversation. There's no question. And I don't want to really start the discussion on where things went wrong and all of that sort of thing. But when I see Israel held up to the same standard, parity is a very important part of my own thinking as a person, personally, certainly politically. Let's just really all look at each other as equals. Until that happens, it seems to me, something continues to be missing. So that question really ought to be addressed to Israel, including on practical issues. I didn't really get a chance to really talk about issues of Area C, the impediments that are put in, on the way to really the Palestinians trying to project the reality of our state on the ground anyway. Anyone who really has tried to do something about this would tell you volumes about it. And the way the current Israeli leadership describes our effort in Area C, it describes it as transgression on Israeli territory.
Yeah. So what you're saying is that the commitment to previous agreements is a two-way street.
It's a commitment to it's a two-way street. That's for certain. Absolutely, it has to really be looked at. The second point is, even with that, in my own political thinking on this does not really involve saying, no, we give up and we really do not want. I said very clearly, as part of this unity agreement, the PLO, as we know it today, its platform is to remain unchanged. I meant that, you know what I'm saying? But in negotiating to get to a solution cannot happen without everyone really agreeing on the fundamentals of that negotiation, including what I really believe all Palestinians can agree to today, which is, yes, you can go negotiate. They can tell our leadership to go negotiate, provided that Israel recognizes our national rights in the way that I described them. So that's the way in which really you can turn that corner. Now, again, there is no solution anytime soon. So what we're looking at is a period during which that restoration can take place and some openings looked for. If some opening really comes up at a given point in time, I'm the first one to say, jump on it and take it. And let's have a referendum and see, if people agree and move on. Okay. But to really have everything kind of really pivoted on that is not only a waste of time, it's just being counterproductive, and it will continue to be divisive on our side, certainly an impediment in the way of something which I view as absolutely important: unity. You can't win national liberation divided. You can't get anywhere divided. You really need to bring everybody. And then we'll worry about what we really need to do in terms of how we configure and calibrate and express and manage our international relations. But to really put the cart in front of the horse and say, this is what Israel is doing, it's not fair, I think.
Okay, normalization.
It didn't work. Apart from fairness, it just did not work. Now, the other regional question is important. The API Arab Peace Initiative of 2002, spring 2002, for a long period of time, at least insofar as Arab countries, Arab position is concerned, and I would say, past the roadmap 2003 and all. Past that period of time, it became nothing more than just something to really put statements on the question of Palestine. If you really go to Arab Cemetery, you'll find it everywhere. I mean, readiness to engage on the basis of Arab Peace Initiative as it existed. It became clear over time that was not really going to really take us to where we wanted to go. But it was just left alone, but continued to be referred to as a basis for a settlement, both between Palestinians and Israelis, but regionally, and beyond the region, as a matter of fact, also covering the Muslim world when it really became as such. But it didn't. Maybe something could have been done to really turn it into an action plan and link actions that are desired or contemplated with a political process that was going on. It didn't happen. But then came the normalization agreements, and that's what we're really talking about now, which came as a surprise to not only many, most, including Palestinians, myself included. It just happened, and it was shocking when it happened, but it did happen. That's a part of the reality that we really have to deal with. So we have a choice. As much as I personally, and I think most Palestinians dread the fact that API was turned on its head in the way it was, realistically, we have a decision to make. If we don't like it enough, so should we really mobilize to really try to overturn it? I mean, the answer is obvious in the way I asked the question. That's a non-starter. So the question then becomes, what can be done in order to really deal with that as a reality? And here is where there is a link in this thinking of mine, called the concoction, if you will, but at least it makes sense to me. And I hope it really will be considered adequately. Rejected, fine, but considered. Again, going back to what I call the act of restoration that's really needed on our side. What is needed before anything else? Before anything else, is for us Palestinians to really come up with something that goes beyond a statement of objectives. To say that we want to liberate ourselves, we want to end the occupation, want to have a state on 6/7 with East Jerusalem as its capital, all of this is fine. But I don't think it's really any more adequate. I think what is really absolutely essential, and that's where I really always think about what we, the weakest in the links, but really I think we really hold the key. It's an integral part of my own thinking that until and unless we really begin to assume active agency in our own liberation, we're not really going to go anywhere. And that's an act of empowerment. The minute you begin to think that, then you no longer are the weakest link in the chain. It really is within you, within you. Freedom, liberation is not going to be given to us. It's within us to exercise. It's within us to exercise. It's in that spirit that I believe that we Palestinians are called upon today to put together something that goes beyond a statement of objectives. How is it that we really think we can get there for the next number of years? This is our objective, and I think our Arab brothers would agree on the objective that I have just outlined. There's not going to be disagreement at all on that. And then a plan as to how we're going to really, over this time period, going to really begin this process of restoration, establish unified framework, establish unity, and begin to really actually take care of the needs of the people in the context of politically acceptable to all kind of framework, and discuss this with our Arab brothers before anyone else. Before anyone else, there's a logical sequence to this. The business about lamenting the upending of the API and all that, we've done enough of that. And I'm there, to be honest with you. Sentimentally, I'm there. I'm not dissociating myself from there. I am not. I'm not today. I wish it didn't happen because we lost something important. But it happened. How do we deal with it? We begin in earnest this process of restoration and put together a vision as to how we're going to really get to where we're going. Engage today before tomorrow, tomorrow before the after, with Arab partners who have a stake in this more immediately than others, on the elements of our own thinking, and have that discussion in a frank way. I am not looking for statements for Arab countries that say, we support the Palestinians, whatever their choices are. I appreciate that, really, honestly. But we really need to go beyond that. We need to establish partnership, meaningful partnership. I just don't see how we really can manage to deal, negotiate, end conflict with key Arab players who are in the immediate vicinity of where we are on the issues that were outlined and deferred for negotiations without the direct involvement and partnership of the countries that I have in mind and I'm talking about. No secret, I'm talking about Egypt and Jordan and others. But begin that conversation. Begin that conversation. How is it possible for us to be talking about Rafah crossing? By the way, something that nobody kind of paid enough attention to in the so-called Trump plan, Israel returned to Rafah. It kind of slipped by everyone else. Rafah is a Palestinian issue, but it's also an Egyptian issue. You understand what I'm saying? So I can't go on. But the point is, have that vision. First, agree on it at the Palestinian level. And then for our leadership to take it in earnest, in a serious way, and have a serious conversation with Arab countries, not to the exclusion of others beyond the ones that I mentioned. But then when there is, coalescing on the broad parameters, what we were talking about, take it to the Arab League and have it become a pan-Arab position. So it's guiding, it's an organizing principle for the manner in which Arab countries individually and collectively can engage with the international community.
So just to take this to a very concrete level, for one example, are you suggesting that the Palestinian leadership could ask Arab states to support them in their demand that Israel allow elections in East Jerusalem?
For example, but I just mentioned the elections in East Jerusalem as an example, what I'm talking about, in order to really impart credibility to statements of policy about restoration of norms and reversal of transgressions.
Understood.
But in the bigger scheme of things, what I'm talking about is not really in the way it happened vis-a-vis Jordan and Israel. Whenever we get in trouble on Jerusalem, Jordan gets involved naturally, as one would expect. Other Arab countries and all, when there is an issue to be resolved, that comes with the territory. There are issues every day of that kind that happen. Some more frequent than others. But I'm really talking about something more fundamental than that.
Yeah.
In the context of a doctrine, API was a doctrine. And it's not only Palestinians, but Arabs collectively. I mean, this is addressed as much to the Arab League as anyone else, to be honest with you. Arabs collectively have to really agree on a new platform. I mean, again, they can engage in conversation of why it happened this way or not the other way, but it's a reality.
So we're running out of time.
Begins with us. That activity begins with us. We really need to really discuss it, have it agreed, and then transform it into a pan-Arab position. The Arab dimension to the Palestinian cause is hugely important, and it serves no purpose of ours to really not understand that and assimilate it fully and operationalize it. That operationalizing part of things cannot even begin before we have a concept that we Palestinians can agree on.
Thank you. So Salam, what I hear you saying is, in order to resuscitate anything that we might call a peace process, Palestinians have to begin in their closest circle and then move outward, getting consensus, getting agreement, and moving outward to the Arab world, to the United States, and to Israel. By
the way, I'm looking for a meaningful conversation. There's no presumption on my side, for sure, and there shouldn't be on our side. I mean, we look at Arab countries, our immediate partners. I really take these things very seriously. Partnership is important concept. Partnership doesn't really mean I let you know after I do something. But partnership, genuine partnership, doesn't mean and should not mean that you tell me I support you whatever you do.
Right.
I mean, that's parental love, that's
we had a very similar conversation in the US panel opening this morning about the JCPOA and American consultations with regional partners. That partnership means we consult before we conclude an agreement, not afterwards. So I appreciate the principle. We're going to have to end, unfortunately, although you and I know could go on for hours in this conversation, and I'm so grateful. I want to thank you. I want to thank everyone who joined us throughout a very rich morning. And I want to remind you all that we are going to reconvene on Wednesday at 9 a.m. Washington time to hear from President Barham Saleh of Iraq. So thank you all so much. Dr. Salam, thank you. And have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Thanks.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay, we are clear.